The freezing rain lashed against the windshield of my truck, mirroring the sharp, dull ache radiating through my surgically repaired shoulder. Physical therapy had ended an hour early, a rare reprieve in a schedule otherwise dictated by military-grade discipline. I parked in the driveway of the pristine four-bedroom colonial home I shared with Wyatt. To the outside world, we were the quintessential American success story, the rising wealth manager and his quietly retired veteran wife. Inside, the silence of the house was always deafening. I unlocked the front door with a quiet click. Beside me, Duke, my German Shepherd service dog, immediately stiffened. His ears pinned back and a low, barely audible rumble vibrated in his chest. Duke was trained to detect threats, stress, and anomalies in my environment. Right now, every instinct he possessed was locked onto the second floor. I released the clasp on his leash, signaling him to stay close, and moved silently up the carpeted stairs. The sound of muffled laughter and the rhythmic creak of the floorboards echoed down the hallway. It was coming from the master bedroom. I didn't hesitate. I didn't announce myself. I simply pushed the bedroom door open. There, tangled in the imported Egyptian cotton sheets I had purchased just last month, was Wyatt. Beneath him was Sydney. I recognized her instantly, the 28-year-old daughter of one of Wyatt's most lucrative elite partners. She let out a sharp theatrical gasp, pulling the duvet up to her chest, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and poorly concealed amusement. Wyatt, however, didn't flinch. There was no scrambling for clothes, no stuttered apologies, no frantic pleas for forgiveness. He casually sat back against the tufted headboard, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He looked at me, taking in my rain-dampened clothes, the slight limp in my stance, and the imposing presence of Duke at my side. "You're home early," Wyatt said, his voice terrifyingly steady, devoid of a single ounce of remorse. "Therapy usually keeps you busy until 4. I stood perfectly still. Years of tactical training and high-stress combat logistics kicked in, freezing the panic and locking my emotions behind an impenetrable wall of ice. I didn't scream. I didn't throw a lamp. I just watched him. "Don't look at me like that, Blair," Wyatt scoffed, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He didn't even bother to cover himself. "This was inevitable. Look at you." He gestured vaguely in my direction, his lips curling into a cruel sneer. "You're a ghost. You sleep with one eye open, you jump at shadows, and you drag this mutt everywhere like a crutch." He stepped closer, his voice dropping into a condescending whisper. "You're cold, Blair. You're damaged. I need a real woman. Someone warm, someone who actually fits into my world, not a broken soldier playing house." Sydney giggled from the bed, wrapping the sheet tighter around herself. "Wyatt, baby, maybe she should leave so we can finish." The sheer audacity of the betrayal hung heavy in the humid air of the bedroom. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to shatter, to cry, to prove his narrative that I was an unstable, hysterical veteran who couldn't handle civilian life. Instead, I reached out and gently patted Duke's head, calming the low growl rumbling in his throat. Without a single word, I turned on my heel. I walked into the adjoining walk-in closet, grabbed my old heavy-duty army jacket from the back hook, and slung it over my uninjured shoulder. I didn't pack a suitcase. I didn't gather my jewelry or my clothes. I didn't need any of it. "That's right, just walk away," Wyatt called out from the bedroom, his voice echoing down the stairs as I descended. "Run back to your parents. See if they want to deal with your baggage." The drive to my parents' sprawling estate took 20 minutes. The freezing rain had turned into a torrential downpour, washing the suburban streets in a bleak gray haze. My mind operated with cold mechanical precision. Wyatt had crossed a line, but I knew my family. I knew the environment. I had grown up in a fortress of expectations where appearances meant everything and vulnerability was treated as a disease. I pulled my truck up to the wrought iron gates of my parents' house. I walked up the manicured stone pathway, Duke marching in perfect lockstep beside me, the icy rain soaking through my military jacket. I knocked firmly on the heavy oak door. It swung open to reveal my father Thomas. Behind him stood my mother Carolyn, her arms crossed tightly over her cashmere sweater. Their expressions were not etched with concern or surprise. They were etched with deep, unmistakable irritation. Before I could even open my mouth, Thomas spoke. "Wyatt called us," my father said, his voice dripping with icy disapproval. He glared at my wet uniform, then down at Duke, his lip curling in disgust. He told us about your violent episode. I froze, the cold rain suddenly feeling insignificant compared to the chill radiating from my own flesh and blood. Wyatt had spun a narrative before I even put the keys in the ignition. He had painted me as the aggressor, a veteran having a PTSD meltdown, and they had swallowed the lie whole. He was in our bed with another woman. I stated, my voice flat, devoid of the hysteria they were clearly waiting for. "Stop it, Blair," Carolyn snapped, stepping forward. "Wyatt said you were hallucinating again. He said you threatened him. We are not doing this tonight. We have an image to maintain, and we cannot have police showing up because you refuse to manage your trauma." "She only brings trouble," a voice echoed from the grand staircase. My brother Jason walked down, swirling a glass of bourbon. In his tailored suit, he looked exactly like the corporate lawyer. He was arrogant, dismissive, and utterly devoid of empathy. "Send her back, Dad. I'm not dealing with her legal mess if she assaulted Wyatt." Thomas placed his hand on the heavy brass doorknob, preparing to shut me out into the storm. He looked me dead in the eye, stripping away the last remaining illusion I had of family. "Don't bring your mess here again," he said coldly. For a fraction of a second, I looked at the three of them. My father, my mother, my brother. They had chosen the wealthy, charismatic son-in-law over their own flesh and blood. They had chosen the comfortable lie over the ugly truth. They thought I was a broke, dependent, disabled veteran with nowhere else to go. I reached down, adjusting Duke's leash. I looked right past my father, staring into the warm, illuminated foyer of my childhood home. "Keep him," I said. I turned my back on them before the door even clicked shut. I walked through the freezing rain, climbed back into the driver's seat of my truck, and slammed the door. The heater roared to life, warming my damp hands. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I reached into the hidden compartment beneath the center console. I bypassed the emergency cache and pulled out a heavy, matte black corporate card. Engraved in sleek metallic lettering across the front was a name my family had never heard, and a title Wyatt had no idea I possessed: Vanguard Defense Logistics, Blair founder, and CEO. I stared at the card as the storm raged outside. They thought I was a victim. They had no idea they had just declared war on a ghost. The morning light broke through the grimy, slatted blinds of a roadside motel on the outskirts of the city. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, lacing up my boots with my good arm, while Duke sat at attention by the door. The freezing rain from the previous night had frozen over, turning the asphalt outside into a slick sheet of ice. I stepped out of the room, the frigid air hitting my face, and walked toward the small diner attached to the motel lot. A black coffee was all I needed to kickstart the protocol. Inside, the diner smelled of stale grease and burned filter coffee. I approached the counter, ordered a large black drip, and swiped my debit card. The machine beeped a harsh, denying tone. The cashier, a tired-looking woman in a faded apron, handed the card back. She said it was declined. I tried the secondary credit card. Declined again. I stepped aside, pulling my phone from my pocket. A barrage of notifications flooded the screen. They were automated alerts from my bank. Checking account balance 0. Savings account balance 0. Wyatt had initiated a wire transfer at exactly 2 in the morning, draining the entire $60,000 we had in our joint reserves. He had not stopped there. My health insurance portal showed my login was revoked, and a separate notification from our auto lender indicated my truck had been reported as stolen. Then a direct message from Wyatt illuminated the screen. It was a photo. 7 black garbage bags sat on the snow-covered front lawn of our pristine suburban home. The caption below it read, "The locks are changed. My lawyer just filed the papers. I am requesting expedited spousal support. A judge is not going to look kindly on an unemployed, unstable veteran who assaulted her husband. You have nothing, Blair. Do not try to fight me." Attached to the text was a PDF scan of a court filing. Wyatt was officially claiming I was completely dependent on his income, citing my military medical discharge as proof of my inability to hold a job. He was demanding a monthly stipend, trying to legally bleed me dry before I could even find my footing. He really thought he had orchestrated a masterclass in psychological warfare. He thought he had severed my lifelines, leaving me isolated, penniless, and desperate. I stared at the image of the garbage bags on the wet grass. I did not feel a trace of panic. I felt an icy, surgical focus settling into my veins. Wyatt fundamentally misunderstood who he had married. He saw a broken soldier. He failed to realize that the military does not just break people, it teaches them how to dismantle their enemies with absolute precision. I smiled a sharp, cold expression. I gave the cashier a $10 bill from my pocket, took my coffee, and walked back out into the freezing morning. I stood by my frozen truck, petting Duke's head as he leaned against my leg. I bypassed the standard contacts on my phone and opened a highly encrypted application. I typed in a 12-digit sequence and waited. The line connected immediately. "Initiate protocol," I said calmly. "Send transport to my current coordinates." Exactly 14 minutes later, a matte black, heavily armored SUV glided into the motel parking lot, its tires crunching over the ice. The vehicle pulled up right in front of me. The driver, a broad-shouldered ex-ranger named Hayes, stepped out instantly. He did not ask questions. He simply opened the rear door, nodding respectfully, as Duke jumped in, followed by me. "Downtown," I instructed. The SUV merged onto the highway, leaving the cheap motel and the remnants of my fake suburban life in the rearview mirror. We bypassed the morning traffic with practiced ease, gliding toward the financial district. The city skyline loomed ahead, dominated by towering monuments of corporate power. We pulled into the secure underground garage of a sleek 90-story glass high-rise. This building was the nerve center of the city's defense contractors, a place Wyatt could only dream of entering. Hayes escorted me to a private unmarked elevator. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner panel. The light flashed green, and the elevator shot upward without stopping until it reached the top floor. The steel doors slid open, revealing a sprawling, ultra-modern executive suite. The logo etched into the frosted glass partition read, "Vanguard Defense Logistics." The company handled multi-million-dollar supply chain contracts for federal agencies, moving critical assets across the globe. To the public, Vanguard was run by a faceless board of directors. To Wyatt, I was just a housewife collecting a modest disability check. As I walked down the central corridor, the ambient chatter of the trading floor ceased. Men and women in sharp business attire stopped what they were doing. They stood up from their desks, parting like the Red Sea. "Good morning, Madam CEO," a senior analyst said, dipping his head. "Good morning, boss," another echoed. I nodded to them, moving with a commanding stride that had nothing to do with a limp and everything to do with ownership. I pushed open the double doors to my corner office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the entire city. I took a seat behind the massive mahogany desk, Duke immediately taking his post by the door. I hit the intercom button. "Send in the legal and cyber teams, now." Within seconds, 3 of the sharpest corporate sharks on the East Coast filed into my office. They stood at attention, waiting for my directive. I slid my phone across the desk, the screen displaying Wyatt's text message and the name of his wealth management firm. "This is Wyatt's firm," I stated, my voice echoing off the glass walls. "I want a complete, unauthorized shadow audit of every single transaction he has handled for the last 3 years. Trace his clients, trace his offshore accounts, trace every penny he has ever touched. He just stole $60,000 from a joint account and filed for spousal support." My lead counsel, a ruthless attorney named Carter, let out a low whistle. "He is trying to claim you are financially dependent." "He thinks I am unemployed," I replied, lacing my fingers together. "He thinks he has the upper hand. I want you to prove him wrong, but not in court. Not yet. I want his financial footprint dissected. Find the shell companies he is using to hide his assets. When you find the vulnerabilities in his firm's portfolio, we are going to build a trap. We are not just going to divorce him, we are going to liquidate him." The cyber director tapped his tablet, already initiating the background breach. "What about the $60,000 he took, Madam CEO? Let him keep it," I said, leaning back in my leather chair. "Let him feel invincible for a few days. Arrogance makes people careless. By the time he realizes who he actually married, he won't even own the shirt on his back. The team nodded, instantly dispersing to execute the orders. I swiveled my chair to face the sprawling city below. The storm clouds were breaking sunlight glinting off the skyscrapers. Wyatt had chosen to play a game of control, thinking he was the predator. He had no idea he had just walked into the crosshairs of a military strategist who commanded an empire. The war had officially begun. Over the next 48 hours, the digital battlefield ignited. Wyatt, operating under the delusion that he held all the cards, launched a synchronized and utterly ruthless social media smear campaign. He was too cowardly to do it alone, so he enlisted the ultimate weapon of suburban warfare, my mother. Sitting in the secure confines of my penthouse suite, sipping black coffee, I watched the orchestrated character assassination unfold across every major platform. Carolyn had outdone herself. She posted a lengthy, tear-stained manifesto detailing the profound tragedy of mental illness. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a combat veteran who had lost her grip on reality, spinning Wyatt's infidelity into a narrative of survival. According to my mother, Wyatt was a battered spouse, seeking refuge from my supposed violent PTSD episodes. But the absolute crescendo of her digital performance was the introduction of Sydney. Carolyn brazenly tagged the 28-year-old heiress, publicly praising her as a healing presence and an angel who had saved Wyatt from a dark, dangerous living situation. The post went viral within our elite social circles. Comments flooded in, showering Wyatt with faux sympathy and applauding my parents for their bravery in speaking out. My brother Jason shared the post, adding a sterile, legally polished comment about the difficulties of getting appropriate care for unstable veterans. They were systematically dismantling my reputation, laying the groundwork for a narrative that framed me as a volatile threat. It was a textbook psychological operation designed to isolate the target. I did not issue a public statement. I did not retaliate with angry comments or leaked screenshots. I maintained absolute radio silence, letting them gorge themselves on their own false victimhood. Silence in warfare is often the most terrifying sound. My encrypted phone vibrated against the marble countertop, shattering the quiet of the room. It was not a number I recognized, and the message was routed through a secure, untraceable server protocol that only someone intimately familiar with high-level corporate espionage would know how to use. The text contained coordinates for a dilapidated diner 40 miles outside the city limits, along with the time and 2 words. Come alone. I traded my tailored suit for unmarked civilian clothes, leashed Duke, and took an untraceable fleet vehicle from the Vanguard garage. The drive took me deep into the industrial outskirts, far away from the polished high-rises and pristine country clubs my family frequented. The diner sat isolated on a stretch of cracked highway, its neon sign flickering sporadically against the twilight sky. I parked in the shadows, letting Duke survey the perimeter before stepping inside. The air smelled of stale grease and black coffee. The place was entirely empty except for one figure sitting in the furthest, darkest booth. I approached quietly. Sitting there flawlessly dressed in a sharp maroon trench coat was Monique, Jason's wife, my sister-in-law. At Sunday family dinners, Monique was a masterclass in quiet compliance. For 5 years, she had played the role of the dutiful, soft-spoken, agreeable wife to my arrogant brother. She let Jason interrupt her. She smiled politely at my mother's condescending remarks, and she kept her opinions meticulously hidden. But the woman sitting across from me now was not the docile suburban accessory I thought I knew. Her posture was rigid, her dark eyes sharp and calculating. The mask was completely off. She did not offer a warm greeting. She simply slid a silver encrypted flash drive across the sticky Formica table. I looked at the drive, then up at her. Her expression was deadly serious. Monique leaned forward, intertwining her manicured fingers. She dropped the quiet housewife persona and spoke with the rapid, surgical precision of a corporate assassin. She revealed that she had been monitoring Jason's private communications for months. Jason was not just turning a blind eye to Wyatt's infidelity or simply sharing my mother's social media posts. He was acting as Wyatt's shadow counsel. The two of them were actively colluding behind closed doors, navigating the legal loopholes to completely bypass the standard divorce proceedings. I picked up the flash drive, feeling its weight. Monique's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, spelling out the true depth of their treachery. Wyatt and Jason had paid off a private, unethical psychiatrist to forge a series of backdated medical evaluations. They were actively drafting an emergency petition to have me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility. The smear campaign online was not just petty revenge, it was a calculated legal foundation. By establishing a public record of my supposed mental instability and violent outbursts corroborated by my own parents, the forged medical records would sail through a sympathetic judge's chamber. Once I was locked away under a psychiatric hold, Wyatt would be granted emergency conservatorship. He would gain immediate, uncontested ownership of our marital home. Worse, he and Jason had found a mechanism to seize my military pension, funneling it directly into Wyatt's depleted accounts to cover the massive debts he was secretly hiding. They were not just trying to ruin my reputation. They were planning to steal my freedom, strip me of my assets, and lock me in a cage. I stared at the African-American woman across from me, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. My brother was attempting to institutionalize me for profit. Monique watched the realization settle over my features. A slow, chilling smirk spread across her face. She reached out and tapped the flash drive resting near my hand. She had provided me with the forged documents, the email trails, the wire transfers, paying off the doctor, and the drafted court petitions. She had handed me the exact weapon needed to detonate their entire scheme. She stood up, pulling the collar of her trench coat tight. She looked down at me, her eyes burning with a mutual, unspoken understanding of what it meant to survive in that toxic family. She did not offer me pity. She offered me an execution order. "Destroy them," she said. Monique turned and walked out of the diner, leaving me alone in the booth. I closed my fist around the silver flash drive, the cold metal biting into my palm. Duke rested his heavy head on my knee, sensing the lethal shift in my demeanor. The smear campaign was a distraction. The real attack was coming, but thanks to the most unlikely ally, I was holding the detonator. The flash drive from Monique felt heavy in my pocket, a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. I did not sleep that night. By dawn, Vanguard's elite cybersecurity division had already decrypted and verified every single document my sister-in-law had provided. The forged medical records, the illicit wire transfers to the corrupt psychiatrist, and the drafted petitions for involuntary commitment were all securely backed up on multiple off-site corporate servers. My legal team was in the process of drafting a devastating countersuit when a notification chimed on my secure tablet. It was a formal summons from Wyatt demanding a mediation meeting at noon. The location he selected was highly calculated, the Pinnacle Country Club. Pinnacle was a bastion of generational wealth and old money, a sprawling gated estate of manicured golf courses and vaulted dining halls where my parents held VIP status. Wyatt chose it specifically to corner me on their home turf. He wanted me surrounded by their influence, intimidated by the quiet hum of power that radiated from the club's members. He expected the broken, discarded veteran to walk through those heavy oak doors trembling, crushed under the weight of her own supposed inadequacies. He wanted a public venue where any emotional reaction from me would immediately validate their narrative of my instability. I arrived at precisely noon. I traded my tactical gear for a tailored charcoal gray suit that cost more than Wyatt's entire seasonal wardrobe, though the label was discreet enough to go unnoticed by untrained eyes. Duke walked perfectly at my side, his service vest immaculate and his focus unyielding. The valet rushed forward, stammering a bit as I handed him the keys to a fresh Vanguard-issued armored sedan. We bypassed the main lobby and the judgmental stares of the club's elite patrons, heading straight for the executive dining wing. I did not wait for the maitre d' to announce my arrival. I opened the door to the private suite without knocking. The room smelled of aged leather, expensive cigars, and suffocating arrogance. Wyatt sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table, nursing a glass of sparkling water with a look of supreme confidence. Thomas and Carolyn sat on either side of him, forming a united front. As I walked in, their hushed conversation stopped instantly. My mother let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, looking at me with eyes full of fabricated pity. My father crossed his arms, his posture rigid with sheer disapproval. "Have a seat, Blair," Wyatt said, using a tone one might reserve for a disobedient child. I did not sit. I stood at the opposite end of the long table, resting my hands lightly on the back of the plush leather chair. Duke sat obediently at my feet, his eyes locked on Wyatt. "I want to make this easy for everyone," Wyatt continued, steepling his fingers and leaning forward. He projected the image of a benevolent victim, a man eager to put a tragic chapter behind him for the good of all involved. "You are clearly unwell. Your mother and father agree that a drawn-out legal battle would only exacerbate your mental state. I am willing to offer you a clean break." He reached into his breast pocket, retrieved a pristine white envelope, and slid it across the polished mahogany. It glided smoothly, coming to a halt right in front of me. Alongside it was a thick legal document flagged with bright yellow sticky notes. "That is a quitclaim deed and an ironclad non-disclosure agreement," Wyatt explained, his voice smooth and practiced. "You sign over your interest in the house, and in exchange I am giving you a check to help you get back on your feet. You take the money, you walk away quietly, and we do not pursue the emergency psychiatric hold your family and I have been discussing. It is the best possible outcome for a woman in your condition." I looked down at the check protruding from the envelope. It was written out for exactly $5,000. It was a calculated insult, a sum so small it was meant to underscore my complete lack of worth in their eyes. "Sign the paper, Blair," Thomas barked, leaning forward and tapping his knuckles against the table. His patience was already wearing thin. "Stop embarrassing us in our own club. Wyatt is being more than generous considering your erratic behavior and the trauma you have inflicted on this family. Take the money, find a small apartment, and get the help you clearly need. We will not tolerate another one of your episodes here." Carolyn nodded in agreement, dabbing the corner of her perfectly dry eye with a linen napkin. "We just want peace, darling. Sydney has brought such a calming presence to Wyatt's life. She is exactly what he needs right now. You need to sign the papers and let him move on." They waited for the explosion. They wanted the yelling, the anger, the tears. They needed the hysterical, unhinged veteran to lash out and validate the forged medical evaluations sitting on Jason's desk. They needed a scene. Instead, I reached out and picked up the check. I held it up to the light, filtering through the stained glass windows, examining the signature. $5,000. I stated, my voice completely devoid of inflection or emotion. "It is a fair transition fund," Wyatt replied, a smug, victorious smile creeping onto his face as he assumed I was accepting defeat. "More than you are legally entitled to given your lack of contribution to the household over the last few years." I did not argue. I brought my hands together and deliberately, methodically tore the check in half. The crisp sound of ripping paper echoed sharply in the quiet room. Wyatt's smile faltered instantly. I placed the halves together and tore them again. I continued the motion until the check was reduced to a handful of tiny, meaningless squares. I opened my hand and let the confetti fall, watching it scatter across the signature lines of the quitclaim deed. Wyatt stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the hardwood floor, his face flushed with sudden volatile anger. "What is wrong with you? That is the only lifeline you are going to get." I walked down the length of the table, my footsteps completely silent on the thick Persian rug. Thomas opened his mouth to shout an order, demanding I return to my seat, but I ignored him completely. I stopped right next to Wyatt's chair. He instinctively leaned back, his eyes flashing with a sudden, genuine apprehension as I encroached on his personal space. I leaned down until my face was inches from his ear. The scent of his expensive cologne was overpowering, masking the faint smell of nervous sweat. "Cayman National Bank." I whispered, my voice so low and precise that neither of my parents could hear a single syllable. I recited a sequence of 14 digits with perfect, unyielding accuracy. "Routing number ending in 472. The exact shadow ledger where you deposited the $2.4 million you embezzled from the Holden and Vance portfolios last quarter." Wyatt stopped breathing. His entire body went rigid. The flush of arrogant anger vanished from his cheeks, replaced instantly by a sickening, chalky white pallor. His eyes dilated in sheer, unadulterated terror as he stared straight ahead, completely paralyzed by the realization that his deepest, most guarded criminal secret was known. I straightened my posture and smoothed the lapels of my jacket. I did not offer an explanation. I did not deliver a dramatic monologue about Vanguard Defense Logistics or the shadow audit my legal team had just completed. The string of numbers was more devastating than any threat I could have vocalized. "Heel," I commanded quietly. Duke rose instantly from his position across the room, falling in line beside me with military precision. I turned and walked toward the exit without a backward glance. "Blair, get back here!" Thomas yelled, slamming his hand on the table in frustration. "Wyatt, what did she say to you? What is going on?" I pulled the heavy oak door open and stepped out into the plush hallway, letting the door click shut behind me. Through the thick wood, I could hear my mother frantically asking Wyatt what was wrong, her voice tinged with confusion and rising panic. Wyatt did not answer her. I knew he couldn't speak. He was too busy realizing that the woman he thought he could discard with a $5,000 check had just handed him a one-way ticket to federal prison. Back at the glass and steel fortress of Vanguard Defense Logistics, the atmosphere hummed with a focused predatory intensity. The hushed, suffocating elegance of the country club felt like a lifetime ago. I strode directly into the secure subterranean server floor, a sprawling space bathed in the cool blue glow of monitors and the low hum of advanced cooling units. My chief cybersecurity officer, a brilliant former intelligence operative named Chen, was waiting for me at the central command console. The initial breach of Wyatt's Cayman accounts had merely scratched the surface of the corruption. Now Chen's team had cracked the encrypted ledgers wide open, exposing the absolute rot at the core of Wyatt's wealth management firm. The conflict had officially escalated from a messy domestic dispute into a full-scale corporate siege. I stood behind Chen watching streams of financial data scroll across the massive main display. It was significantly worse than simple embezzlement. Wyatt was not merely skimming off the top of elite portfolios to fund his lifestyle. He was orchestrating a massive hollow shell game. He was moving fresh capital from new investors to pay fabricated dividends to his legacy clients. It was a classic, unadulterated Ponzi scheme. His entire firm was bleeding out, operating entirely on borrowed time and stolen capital. But the forensic accounting revealed something far more grotesque than standard corporate fraud. I watched the red lines on the screen trace the flow of the most recently stolen funds. One particular trajectory caught my eye, a massive continuous hemorrhage of capital rooted through a dummy corporation dubbed Apex Holdings. I ordered Chen to trace that specific line. His fingers flew across the keyboard executing the command. The origin point materialized on the screen, and for a fraction of a second, the cold detachment I had carefully cultivated cracked. The drained account belonged to Thomas and Carolyn, my parents. Wyatt had completely gutted their supposedly untouchable retirement fund. Decades of their accumulated wealth, the absolute foundation of their arrogant country club status and social superiority, was entirely gone. I asked where he had routed their capital, my voice dropping an octave as the reality of the betrayal set in. Chen opened a series of digitized receipts and offshore asset registries. Wyatt had not used my parents' life savings to cover his market losses or stabilize his failing firm. He had systematically converted their retirement into tangible, untraceable luxury assets for his mistress. Customized European sports cars registered solely in Sydney's name. High-carat diamond parures acquired from private dealers in Antwerp. A sprawling, ultra-modern beachfront condo leased through an anonymous proxy entity. My mother was currently singing Sydney's praises on social media, publicly validating Wyatt's infidelity, completely oblivious to the fact that the younger woman was literally draped in diamonds, purchased with Carolyn's own stolen future. My parents were enthusiastically funding their own destruction. My lead corporate counsel, Carter, stepped into the ambient glow of the monitors and handed me a thick physical dossier. He explained that Wyatt needed an airtight legal shield to establish these shell companies without triggering federal oversight. He needed a registered guarantor with a spotless corporate law background to legitimize the paperwork. I opened the file. There at the bottom of dozens of fraudulent incorporation documents was the bold, sweeping signature of my brother Jason. In his blind arrogance and his desperate need to partner with Wyatt's perceived wealth, Jason had not bothered to conduct even the most basic due diligence. He had signed off as the primary guarantor for every single one of Wyatt's toxic shell entities. Jason was legally and financially tethered to a collapsing Ponzi scheme. He was no longer just an arrogant lawyer looking down on his veteran sister. He was criminally culpable in a massive federal fraud case. Carter looked at me, anticipating the next logical command in our corporate playbook, asking if he should compile the brief for the FBI white-collar division. We had enough hard evidence to put both my ex-husband and my brother away for 20 years. I closed the dossier, the smooth cardstock cold against my fingertips. Turning them over to federal authorities would be swift, but it would lack the surgical precision this magnitude of betrayal demanded. Prison was a consequence, but I wanted absolute, undeniable control over their fate. I told Carter that the authorities would immediately freeze all the assets and tie everything up in litigation for a decade. I wanted the board. I wanted the pieces. We were not calling the police. I instructed Carter to immediately activate Obsidian Capital, one of Vanguard's most aggressive and entirely untraceable subsidiary investment wings. The directive I handed down was simple, but utterly devastating. Obsidian was to systematically and quietly purchase every single ounce of debt associated with my family and Wyatt. Within 48 hours, my subsidiary had bought up the highly leveraged commercial loans that were barely keeping Wyatt's wealth management firm afloat. We purchased the massive underwater mortgage on the marital home Wyatt had so confidently locked me out of. I did not stop there. My parents had heavily leveraged their sprawling estate to fund their lavish country club lifestyle, foolishly trusting their non-existent retirement accounts to cover the massive margins. Obsidian Capital bought their mortgage too, swooping in and acquiring the debt from their original lenders at a premium. They were all swimming in a sea of toxic liabilities, completely unaware that the undertow was about to drag them out to the deep. I stood in the center of the server room, watching the final acquisitions clear on the global market trackers. For my entire life, they had dictated my worth, controlled the family narrative, and dismissed my very existence. They thought they held all the power because they held the social status and the outward appearance of generational wealth. But wealth is an illusion, while debt is an undeniable reality. By the time the sun set over Vanguard headquarters, the transition of power was absolute. I owned the commercial paper on Wyatt's firm. I owned the legal leverage over Jason's professional future. I owned the very roof over my parents' heads. I did not just hold their dark secrets. I owned their financial survival, and the trap was firmly set. The trap was firmly set, its steel jaws locked open and waiting for the perfect moment to snap shut. That moment was rapidly approaching, wrapped in the guise of Wyatt's most anticipated social event of the season. His wealth management firm was hosting its annual philanthropic gala, a glittering high society spectacle held at the city's most opulent historic ballroom. It was designed to project an aura of unparalleled success, masking the desperate financial rot eating away at his foundation. For my parents, this event was the social equivalent of a royal coronation. Thomas and Carolyn were already circulating through their elite networks in the days leading up to the party, boasting loudly about the exclusive guest list. My mother was practically vibrating with excitement, pre-planning the official introduction of Sydney to their country club peers. She was referring to the 28-year-old heiress as her future daughter-in-law, eager to publicly cement the narrative that Wyatt had mercifully moved on from his disastrous, unstable first marriage. They were completely oblivious to the predator circling their glass house. Operating from the sterile shadows of my corporate command center, I directed Obsidian Capital to make a staggering, untraceable charitable donation to the event's organizing committee. Within minutes, my newly acquired shell corporation had covertly secured the Diamond FIVYP sponsorship. This tier of access granted exclusive entry to the private donor reception and a highly visible table right at the edge of the main stage. Wyatt believed he had just landed a massive anonymous corporate benefactor eager to inject fresh capital into his prestigious failing firm. He had actually just sold the master key to his own execution. While Wyatt and Jason spent their Saturday morning navigating the lush green fairways of an exclusive private golf course, completely blind to the financial guillotine suspended just inches above their necks, The real strategic maneuvers were happening in the quiet of the suburbs. Monique was executing her extraction protocol with breathtaking surgical efficiency. I received secure real-time updates on my tablet as she systematically dismantled her marital ties to my brother. She bypassed his heavily monitored joint accounts, quietly liquidating her personal assets and transferring the funds into an encrypted offshore trust that Vanguard's cyber team had helped her establish overnight. She moved through the pristine suburban house without an ounce of hesitation or regret. She did not leave a sentimental note of explanation or a tearful letter of goodbye. Instead, she left a thick stack of flawlessly drafted, irrevocable divorce papers resting precisely on the center of their imported marble kitchen island. Beside the documents sat her polished wedding band. Her designer luggage was packed into the trunk of a waiting, unmarked town car bound for a private airfield on the edge of the state. By the time Jason finished his 18 holes, drank his clubhouse scotch, and returned to his immaculate empty mansion, his wife would be a ghost. She was completely untethered from the impending federal fallout, leaving him to face the devastating consequences of his fraudulent guarantor signatures entirely alone. Back in my penthouse, the afternoon sun began to dip below the city skyline, signaling the time to discard the armor of my past. The tactical boots, the heavy denim, and the faded military jackets that had defined my aesthetic for years were pushed aside. Tonight required an entirely different caliber of camouflage. I stepped into a custom-tailored midnight blue silk gown, an architectural masterpiece of sharp, clean lines and aggressive elegance. The heavy fabric moved like liquid shadow, falling perfectly against my frame, concealing the rigid, unyielding posture of a combat veteran beneath the guise of high society royalty. The cut was ruthless, designed to command absolute attention the moment I entered a room. My hair was swept up into a severe, immaculate twist, pulling the focus to the sharp angles of my jaw. The only jewelry I wore was a pair of brilliant-cut diamond studs, cold and unforgiving. I looked into the floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting the subtle cuffs of the gown. The woman staring back was not the broken, discarded housewife Wyatt had attempted to erase. She was not the fragile, unstable veteran my mother had described to her friends. She was the chief executive officer of Vanguard Defense Logistics, a lethal apex predator draped in haute couture, ready to walk straight into the lion's den and slaughter the entire pride. The tactical coordination for the evening was flawless, running with the oiled precision of a military strike. Carter and Vanguard's elite legal division had already initiated the final terminal phase of our counter-offensive. Hours earlier, they had securely transmitted a highly classified, heavily redacted dossier to a specialized white-collar crime division of the federal government. The agents had spent the afternoon reviewing the irrefutable hard evidence of Wyatt's Ponzi scheme, the illegally backdated psychiatric evaluations, and Jason's fraudulent corporate signatures. They did not need to build a case. Vanguard had handed them a completed conviction wrapped in a neat, undeniable package. The investigators were fully briefed, fully mobilized, and currently staged in a fleet of unmarked black vehicles in the subterranean parking garage directly beneath the gala venue. I adjusted the microscopic encrypted communication earpiece nestled invisibly in my right ear. Chen's voice crackled through the secure channel, his tone flat and professional, confirming that the federal agents were locked in position at all perimeter exits, silently waiting for my executive signal to breach the ballroom doors. I gave a single curt nod to my reflection in the glass. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the icy, familiar calm of a sniper, waiting for the target to step blindly into the crosshairs. I turned and walked out of the penthouse, the heavy silk of my gown whispering against the marble floor. It was time to attend a party. The armored Vanguard sedan glided through the neon-lit arteries of the city, delivering me to the wrought iron gates of the grand historic ballroom. The exterior was a spectacle of flashing camera bulbs, velvet ropes, and flustered valet attendants scrambling to park a fleet of exotic sports cars. I remained in the darkened back seat, watching the city's financial elite filter through the arched entryway. Hayes, operating as my personal security detail, sat in the driver's seat scanning the perimeter, He offered a sharp affirmative nod in the rearview mirror. The federal agents were firmly in position, cloaked in the shadows of the subterranean parking garage, waiting for the digital tether to snap. I stepped out of the vehicle, the crisp night air biting against my bare shoulders, and adjusted the heavy leather leash in my right hand. Duke stood at absolute attention beside me. His customized black tactical service vest was strapped securely across his broad chest, projecting an aura of disciplined, uncompromising lethality. Inside the cavernous ballroom was a masterclass in aggressive opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted frescoed ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the sea of silk velvet and tailored tuxedos. Waiters in immaculate white coats circulated endlessly with silver trays of beluga caviar and vintage champagne. The air vibrated with the low, self-important hum of old money networking. Through the dense, glittering crowd, I easily spotted the orchestrators of my supposed demise. They held court near the very front of the stage, occupying a prime VIP table that radiated suffocating suburban arrogance. Thomas and Carolyn were in their absolute element, completely intoxicated by their own perceived social elevation. My father was loudly recounting a golf anecdote to a captive audience of junior partners, while my mother held a crystal flute of champagne, tilting her head back in practiced theatrical laughter. Jason stood right beside them, swirling an amber liquid in a heavy lowball glass. He was completely blind to the fact that his wife had just vanished across state lines, leaving him legally tethered to a sinking criminal enterprise. And then there was Wyatt. He stood at the center of their adoring sycophantic circle, flanked by Sydney, who was practically suffocating under the weight of the stolen diamonds wrapped tightly around her neck and wrists. Wyatt looked invincible. He wore a custom-fitted velvet dinner jacket, flashing a blinding, predatory smile at passing investors. He was soaking in the adoration, entirely convinced that his suburban warfare tactics had neutralized me, that my military pension was already legally his, and that his fraudulent empire was entirely secure. He raised his glass high, clinking it against my father's glass to seal their toxic alliance. They were toasting to their own brilliance, celebrating the absolute destruction of my life, while basking in the warm glow of stolen wealth. A sudden chime of a silver spoon against a microphone brought the ambient chatter to an immediate halt. The master of ceremonies, a minor local celebrity with a booming theatrical voice, stepped up to the clear acrylic podium at the center of the main stage. He cleared his throat, adjusting his bow tie as a harsh white spotlight washed over him. He launched into a sickeningly glowing tribute, praising the resilience, the sharp financial acumen, and the unparalleled market foresight of the firm's leading executive. The crowd erupted into rapturous, deafening applause as Wyatt's name was called for the prestigious Wealth Manager of the Year award. Wyatt kissed Sydney softly on the cheek, patted Jason on the shoulder, and practically floated up the carpeted stairs. He took the heavy crystal trophy gripping the edges of the podium and leaned into the microphone. He delivered a smooth, flawlessly practiced speech about navigating turbulent waters, protecting client legacies, and the paramount importance of strong, unwavering family support, gesturing magnanimously toward my beaming parents. Wyatt paused, his expression shifting from humble award recipient to triumphant corporate conqueror. He handed the microphone back to the master of ceremonies, who instructed the audience to remain standing. The MC's voice echoed through the massive sound system, bouncing off the marble pillars. He announced that the evening's unprecedented success, and indeed the firm's record-breaking quarterly margins, were made possible by a singular, extraordinary influx of capital. The firm was honoring a brand new benefactor, an anonymous corporate entity that had generously secured the Diamond FYP sponsorship, single-handedly saving the gala and stabilizing their firm. The MC extended his hand toward the back of the room, inviting this mysterious savior to step out of the shadows, reveal their identity, and join Wyatt on stage to be recognized by the city's elite. The heavy brass-studded mahogany doors at the rear of the grand ballroom did not just open, they were violently thrown wide by two Vanguard security operatives. The heavy thud of the doors hitting the wall reverberated like a gunshot over the hushed anticipation of the crowd. A brilliant tracking spotlight swung instantly from the stage, cutting through the dimness to illuminate the entryway. I stepped straight into the blinding beam of light. The midnight blue silk of my custom-tailored gown caught the light shimmering like a freshly sharpened blade. I did not walk with the broken defensive limp of a traumatized veteran, nor did I shrink under the collective gaze of 1,000 predatory socialites. I moved with the lethal measured stride of a corporate warlord claiming her conquered territory. Duke flanked my left side, walking flawlessly in sync with my movements. His tactical service vest signaled an immediate, undeniable threat amidst the sea of evening gowns. The crowd turned as one massive entity. As I advanced down the central aisle, the sea of elite investors, socialites, and wealth managers instinctively parted. They stepped back, clearing a wide, unobstructed path, their faces registering a mixture of sheer awe and visceral intimidation at the raw power radiating from the aisle. The spotlight tracked my every step, washing over the VIP tables directly beneath the stage. Carolyn was mid-sip, her eyes following the beam of light. When her gaze finally locked onto my face, recognizing the daughter she had tried to erase, the color completely drained from her heavily powdered cheeks. Her fingers went limp. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp, plummeting toward the floor. The glass shattered against the imported marble with a sharp, piercing crash that echoed through the dead-silent ballroom. Next to her, Thomas froze, his jaw slack, the arrogant golf anecdote dying instantly in his throat. Jason gripped the edge of the table, staring in absolute paralyzed confusion. But it was Wyatt's reaction that commanded my ultimate attention. He was still standing at the acrylic podium, the heavy crystal award clutched tightly in his hand. He looked down the aisle, expecting to greet a faceless corporate proxy, a foolish billionaire he could charm and manipulate. Instead, he saw the woman he had tried to institutionalize, the soldier he thought he had broken, marching toward him, dripping in unimaginable wealth and power. The smug, invincible smile evaporated from his face, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. His knuckles turned stark white as he gripped the edges of the podium to keep his knees from buckling. The air evaporated from his lungs. In that agonizing, stretched-out second under the blinding stage lights, Wyatt finally understood that the predator he thought he had caged was actually the one holding the leash, and his absolute doom had just arrived. I took the final steps up the carpeted stairs to the main stage. The soft rustle of my heavy silk gown, the only sound penetrating the sudden paralyzed hush of the room. Duke remained stationed at the exact base of the steps, a silent, imposing sentinel guarding my perimeter, his posture radiating a disciplined, lethal warning to anyone who might think to interfere. Wyatt stumbled backward as I approached the clear acrylic podium, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He desperately tried to project a facade of bewildered amusement, his panicked eyes darting frantically toward the wealthy crowd, searching for an anchor of support that no longer existed. He leaned toward me, his voice a frantic, hissing whisper, demanding to know what kind of deranged, jealous stunt I thought I was pulling. I did not dignify his rising panic with a response. I did not look at him with hatred, sorrow, or any lingering trace of the woman he had once known. I simply reached out, my movements calm and deliberate, and took the microphone directly from his slick, trembling fingers. The massive audience held its collective breath. I could physically feel the anticipation rippling across the sea of upturned faces. The city's wealthy elite were bracing themselves for a messy, emotional spectacle. They expected a scorned, unstable ex-wife to unleash a tearful, humiliating tirade about broken vows, secret affairs, and shattered domestic trust. They were salivating for cheap tabloid drama. I had absolutely no intention of giving them one. I did not shed a single tear. I did not mention the divorce papers, the betrayal, or the young woman draped in diamonds sitting at the front table. Those elements were merely civilian casualties in a much larger war. I was executing a high-level corporate siege, and my weapon of choice was the only thing these people truly respected and fiercely protected. I spoke into the microphone, my voice echoing off the vaulted, frescoed ceilings with cold, resonant authority. I introduced myself not as Wyatt's estranged wife, but as the chief executive officer of Obsidian Capital, the primary and absolute debt holder of his collapsing firm. A loud collective murmur of confusion rippled through the front rows of investors. Before Wyatt could recover enough to signal his security detail to cut the audio feed, I tapped the hidden earpiece and gave Chen the final terminal command to strike. Instantly, the massive high-definition projection screens flanking the main stage flickered and went entirely black. The firm's elegant gold leaf logo vanished, replaced by the stark, glaring interface of a heavily encrypted offshore banking portal. Vanguard's cyber division had completely hijacked the venue's internal audiovisual network, locking out any local override attempts. The murmurs of confusion escalated into sharp, audible gasps as high-resolution images of internal ledgers, dummy corporation registries, and classified wire transfers flooded the massive screens. The raw, unfiltered, and deeply illegal financial anatomy of Wyatt's firm was suddenly exposed for the entire city to witness. I directed the crowd's attention to the scrolling screens, turning the opulent ballroom into a devastating boardroom briefing. I bypassed the emotional infidelity and struck directly at the fiscal rot. I methodically walked the audience through the exact flow of their newly deposited capital. Thick red lines on the digital map snaked across the displays, illustrating exactly how fresh investments were being illegally diverted the moment they cleared. I showed them how their secure municipal bonds, offshore trusts, and supposedly untouchable legacy portfolios were being aggressively liquidated. Wyatt was not generating unprecedented market returns. He was cannibalizing the very foundation of their generational wealth to pay fabricated dividends and mask catastrophic firm-ending market losses. The air in the ballroom grew thick, heavy, and toxic as the reality of the massive Ponzi scheme dawned on the city's most powerful investors. But a truly surgical strike required a specific, devastating focal point to ensure total psychological collapse. I commanded the screens to isolate a single massive trajectory of stolen capital. The digital ledger zoomed in, magnifying the specific routing numbers and account headers until they were 10 feet tall. I looked directly down at the VIP table where my parents were sitting paralyzed in their velvet chairs. The crowd's collective gaze followed mine. The screen illuminated the total remaining balance of Thomas and Carolyn's lifelong retirement portfolio. The number displayed in glaring, unforgiving red font was 0. I narrated the raw data streaming above us, explaining exactly where my parents' generational wealth had vanished. The screens flashed a rapid, undeniable succession of digital receipts and offshore asset registries. I traced the massive fraudulent wire transfers from their gutted accounts directly to a boutique luxury car dealership in Europe, a private diamond broker operating out of Antwerp, and a proxy entity holding the deed to a sprawling, ultra-modern beachfront estate. I pointed a steady, unyielding finger directly at Sydney. The young heiress froze, her eyes widening in terror, suddenly hyper-aware of the high-carat diamond parure resting heavy against her collarbone. I stated clearly, my voice cutting through the rising panic in the room, that the young woman was literally wearing Carolyn's stolen future. My parents had enthusiastically endorsed and paraded the very architect of their absolute financial ruin, willfully financing the mistress's extravagant lifestyle with their own secretly liquidated life savings. The ballroom shattered. The strained silence imploded, replaced by a deafening, visceral eruption of sheer chaos. It was the terrifying sound of 100 billionaires simultaneously realizing they had been robbed blind. Shouts of absolute outrage echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Heavy chairs scraped violently against the marble floor as frantic investors scrambled to their feet, desperately dialing their attorneys and offshore bankers. Thomas slumped forward, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray, clutching his chest and the edge of the table as if the floor had suddenly vanished beneath him. Carolyn let out a sharp, hysterical shriek, lunging across the spilled champagne to physically tear at Sydney's diamond necklace, screaming incoherently about her stolen money and ruined life. On the stage, Wyatt's primal survival instinct finally kicked in, overriding his paralyzing shock. He dropped the Wealth Manager of the Year Crystal Award. It shattered against the heavy base of the podium, sending sharp fragments of glass flying across the carpet. He spun around, abandoning his firm, his mistress, and the remnants of his pride, sprinting wildly toward the heavy velvet curtains concealing the rear service exit. He desperately thought he could vanish into the labyrinth of the venue's catering kitchens and slip away into the night. He burst through the thick fabric, plunging into the dimly lit backstage corridor. But the shadows were already waiting for him. The heavy, unmistakable sound of a physical, tactical struggle echoed momentarily behind the heavy curtain. The federal agents from the elite white-collar crime division, fully briefed and lying in wait, stepped forward from the wings, completely sealing his only escape route. Two massive suited agents grabbed Wyatt by the shoulders of his custom velvet dinner jacket, slamming him forcefully and unapologetically against the steel stage scaffolding. He gasped for air, his arms wrenched violently behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely into place cut cleanly through the surrounding uproar. They did not drag him out the back door in secret to spare his dignity. The agents spun him around and marched him directly out onto the edge of the brilliantly illuminated stage, parading the handcuffed, thoroughly humiliated architect of the city's largest financial fraud in front of every single elite client he had systematically destroyed. The collective gasp that followed Wyatt's public execution echoed like a thunderclap, shattering the last remaining illusion of the evening. The initial paralysis gripping the ballroom violently morphed into absolute hysteria. While the billionaire investors swarmed the exits and screamed into their cell phones, my focus remained locked on the VIP table. Thomas and Carolyn were practically vibrating with a toxic cocktail of denial and terror. My mother, her hands shaking so violently she could barely operate the touchscreen, fumbled with her diamond-encrusted smartphone. My father crowded over her shoulder, his face a canvas of sweating, flushed panic. They bypassed the standard wealth management portals, going straight to their primary banking applications. I watched the exact second the digital reality crushed their suburban kingdom. A guttural, agonizing shriek tore from Carolyn's throat, a sound so raw and unhinged it cut through the surrounding bedlam. The screen displayed their total liquid assets, their savings, their emergency funds, and the heavily leveraged margins they used to fund their country club existence. The interface updated in real time, pulling data from the frozen accounts. Every single digital ledger read exactly $0.00. The numbers were absolute, unforgiving, and entirely irreversible. They had absolutely nothing left. The facade of generational superiority they had worn like impenetrable armor. My entire life dissolved instantly, melting away to reveal the hollow, terrified core beneath. They were no longer the untouchable patriarch and matriarch holding court over local high society. They were broke, exposed, and utterly desperate senior citizens who had financed their own destruction. Carolyn's frantic, tear-streaked eyes darted across the panicked room until they collided with mine. The realization that their discarded, supposedly unstable daughter was standing in the dead center of the room, flanked by elite private security and radiating absolute corporate authority, triggered a primal, desperate survivalist instinct. They scrambled away from the VIP table, their expensive shoes slipping on the champagne-soaked marble, and sprinted toward me like drowning sailors toward a lifeboat. They shoved violently past bewildered socialites, their manicured hands reaching out to grab the silk of my gown. My mother fell to her knees right at the edge of my personal space, hitting the hard floor just inches from Duke's sturdy tactical boots, completely abandoning her polished country club dignity. My father hovered nervously behind her, his chest heaving with panic attacks, his expensive custom tuxedo suddenly looking like a cheap borrowed costume. They sobbed uncontrollably, begging me to deploy Vanguard's vast corporate resources, pleading with me to somehow call my legal team and reverse the catastrophic damage. They were completely, pathetically oblivious to the fact that I was the exact architect of their financial annihilation. They begged me to save the sprawling estate I now legally owned, to restore the massive wealth I had strategically allowed Wyatt to vaporize. I looked down at them, my expression an unreadable mask of ice, offering absolutely no comfort, no reassurance, and no salvation. Across the chaotic expanse of the ballroom, another localized theater of absolute destruction was rapidly unfolding. Jason was backed tightly against a towering, expensive floral arrangement, his face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. Two federal agents had seamlessly detached from the main tactical strike team and successfully cornered him. One of the agents, a tall man with a severe expression, held a thick, sealed evidence folder. Even from a distance across the room, I recognized the sharp, undeniable edges of the fraudulent incorporation documents Obsidian Capital had forwarded to the Bureau. They were demanding immediate, on-the-record answers regarding his signature acting as the primary legally binding guarantor for every single one of Wyatt's toxic, illegal shell entities. Jason was stammering, his hands raised defensively in front of his chest, frantically attempting to deploy his slick, high-priced corporate defense attorney tactics to talk his way out of the trap. He aggressively cited attorney-client privilege, he loudly demanded to see a signed federal warrant, and he vehemently denied any explicit knowledge of the overarching multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. But his desperate legal posturing was entirely useless against hard, irrefutable federal forensic evidence. The agent simply stepped closer, invading his personal space, cutting off his escape routes, making it abundantly clear that he was not being casually interviewed as a concerned bystander. He was being formally detained as a primary complicit co-conspirator in a massive federal fraud operation. Just as the lead agent reached to the small of his back to retrieve a second pair of heavy steel handcuffs, the dense crowd of panicked investors surrounding Jason gracefully parted. Monique stepped into the harsh, flashing lights of the ballroom, looking completely serene, regal, and entirely untouched by the surrounding devastation. She wore a stunning, understated black designer gown, her posture immaculate, projecting the calm, highly focused energy of a woman who had just successfully shed a massive, suffocating weight from her shoulders. She glided smoothly past the bewildered onlookers and stepped directly into the center of the tense federal interrogation. Jason looked at her, his eyes wide with a sudden desperate flare of hope, mistakenly believing his intelligent, well-connected wife had come to provide character support or leverage her own family's vast legal connections to shield him from the agents. Instead, Monique reached calmly into her sleek, minimalist designer clutch. She did not produce a tissue or offer a comforting, supportive hand. She retrieved a thick, beautifully bound stack of pristine legal documents and pressed them firmly against Jason's chest. The divorce papers were absolute, irrevocable, and entirely legally binding, completely severing their union and stripping him of any future access to her carefully extracted, secure offshore trust. She delivered the final, fatal blow to his ego and his financial safety net, without uttering a single syllable, turning her back on him, the exact moment the federal agents securely locked the steel cuffs around his wrists. Monique walked with quiet, powerful dignity straight across the ruined ballroom floor, the crowd parting for her, just as they had for me, joining me at the central aisle. We shared a brief, silent look of mutual, definitive victory. Our extraction protocol was flawlessly complete. With Duke leading the way, his presence parting the last remnants of the panicked crowd, Monique and I turned and walked deliberately out of the historic venue. We left the screaming, ruined investors, the weeping, destitute parents, and the handcuffed, disgraced brother permanently trapped in the burning wreckage of their own arrogant making. We pushed through the heavy, ornate brass doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool night air. The physical transition from the suffocating, panicked, and humid atmosphere of the gala to the quiet, steady hum of the city streets was jarring, but intensely refreshing. My armored Vanguard sedan was waiting precisely at the curb, its engine purring softly with Hayes holding the rear door open for us. But the evening had one final pathetic display of suburban entitlement to offer before the curtain fully closed. A few yards down the valet driveway, bathed in the glow of the street lamps, Sydney was staging a spectacular, unhinged meltdown. She was stomping her expensive red-soled stilettos against the concrete pavement, screaming obscenities at a terrified teenage valet attendant who was cowering behind his podium. She was wildly pointing a manicured finger toward the designated VIP loading zone, loudly demanding the immediate retrieval of her custom European sports car so she could flee the scene. She was entirely comically oblivious to the two stern-faced FBI field agents standing directly beside the sleek vehicle. They were efficiently taping a bright orange, highly visible federal seizure notice directly to the driver's side windshield. The car, purchased entirely with Carolyn's stolen, secretly liquidated retirement funds, was being formally impounded on the spot as stolen property and criminal evidence. Sydney shrieked, clutching the heavy diamond necklace at her throat, threatening to call Wyatt, threatening to sue the entire city, throwing a massive temper tantrum over a confiscated luxury toy, while the man who illegally bought it for her was currently being loaded into a secure federal transport van in the basement garage. I paused with my hand resting on the cool metal handle of my sedan, watching the absurd, tragic consequence of blind, unchecked greed play out under the city streetlights. The transition of power was no longer just a brilliant corporate maneuver executed in the shadows. It was a physical, undeniable, and absolute reality. The morning sun crested the city skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement, where Sydney's impounded sports car had sat just hours before. The glittering carnage of the gala had been swept away by federal investigators and overnight cleaning crews, but the financial devastation was permanent. In the affluent suburbs, a suffocating silence hung over my parents' sprawling estate. Denial is a powerful anesthetic, and Thomas and Carolyn were practically drowning in it. Rather than contacting bankruptcy attorneys or attempting to untangle the federal freeze on their completely gutted accounts, they fell back on the only survival mechanism they knew, projecting an illusion of flawless superiority. They dressed meticulously for their usual Sunday routine. My father donned his crisp, pressed golfing attire, and my mother wrapped herself in pale cashmere, determined to show their faces at the elite country club. They believed that if they simply acted like nothing had happened, the horrific scandal of the previous night would somehow evaporate before the Sunday brunch crowd finished their mimosas. They pulled their remaining leased sedan into the club's pristine circular driveway, pasting on rigid, practiced smiles as they walked through the heavy glass doors. The opulent foyer, normally a place where they held absolute court among their peers, felt noticeably frigid. Whispers followed them like a physical draft. Carolyn marched straight to the maitre d's podium, requesting their usual prime table overlooking the 18th hole, while Thomas handed over his platinum membership card to cover their outstanding monthly dues. The attendant swiped the heavy metal card. The machine returned a sharp, unforgiving red light. He swiped it a second time, his polite smile faltering. The card was completely declined. The club manager, a man who had kissed my father's ring for a decade, stepped out of the back office. He did not offer a warm greeting. Instead, his voice was hushed and apologetic yet unyielding, as he explained that their accounts had been globally frozen, and the board of directors had temporarily suspended their membership privileges, pending the federal investigation into Wyatt's firm. The humiliation was absolute and public. Their peers, the people whose validation they craved more than oxygen, openly stared as Thomas and Carolyn were quietly, firmly escorted off the premises, stripped of their social armor and banished from their sanctuary. The drive back to their estate was conducted in a suffocating, terrified silence. The reality of their destitution was finally breaching the high walls of their denial. But the true depth of the trap I had set had not yet fully closed around them. As they turned into their long, manicured driveway, the sight before them shattered whatever fragile hope they had left. Two unmarked, nondescript sedans were parked directly in front of the grand oak doors of their mansion. Three men in plain, gray suits were waiting on the imported stone steps. They were not federal agents looking for Wyatt. They were private process servers. As Thomas put the car in park, the men approached their expressions entirely devoid of sympathy. The lead server handed my father a thick, heavy stack of legal documents securely bound in a manila folder. Thomas's hands shook violently as he tore open the seal, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. It was not a warning. It was an immediate, uncompromising notice of foreclosure. The documents clearly stated that Obsidian Capital had acquired their heavily leveraged mortgage, and due to their completely liquidated frozen assets, they were in catastrophic default. They did not just lose their retirement fund to a Ponzi scheme, they had lost the very roof over their heads to the subsidiary investment wing I completely controlled. Total, unadulterated panic finally set in, stripping away decades of cultivated arrogance. Thomas, the man who had dictated my worth and dismissed my military service as a pathetic failure, broke down completely. He stood on his own driveway, the foreclosure papers fluttering in the morning breeze, and began to hyperventilate. In a blind panic, grasping at the last conceivable straw of survival, he pulled out his phone. He did not call his lawyers because he could no longer afford them. He called the daughter he had thrown to the wolves. High above the city, bathed in the cool ambient light of my corporate office, I sat behind my sleek, polished obsidian executive desk. The Vanguard Command Center was quiet, humming with the steady rhythm of global logistics. My secure phone illuminated with an incoming call from Thomas. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the shifting balance of power before answering. I did not offer a greeting. I just listened. My father's voice came through the speaker, unrecognizable. He was sobbing, a wet, desperate, and entirely broken sound. He babbled incoherently about the process servers, the frozen accounts, and the country club humiliation. He begged me, his voice cracking with sheer desperation, to use my position at my new company to float them a bridge loan. He pleaded with me to deploy corporate funds to halt the foreclosure, promising that he would pay me back the moment the misunderstanding with Wyatt's firm was sorted out. He was still trying to spin a narrative, still trying to negotiate from a position of authority he no longer possessed. I let the silence stretch over the secure line, allowing his pathetic sobbing to echo in the cavernous space of my office. When I finally spoke, my voice was a lethal, measured whisper, completely devoid of empathy. I did not yell, and I did not gloat. I simply asked him if he remembered the temperature of the rain. The sobbing on the other end of the line faltered, replaced by a confused, terrified silence. I calmly reminded him of the night exactly 5 years ago, when I had stood on those exact same imported stone steps. I reminded him of how the freezing rain had soaked through my thin jacket, how my boots were ruined, and how I had begged for a single night of shelter after my world had collapsed. I painted the picture with surgical precision, recalling the exact sound the heavy oak door made when he and Carolyn looked me directly in the eyes, called me an embarrassing disappointment, and slammed the deadbolt shut in my face. I told him that the cold he was feeling right now, standing on his driveway with nothing to his name, was exactly what he had condemned me to. There would be no bridge loan, there would be no corporate bailout, and there would be absolutely no mercy. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool surface of my desk. I delivered the final ultimatum with the absolute authority of a commanding officer dictating terms of surrender. I informed Thomas that Obsidian Capital owned the paper on their estate, and the foreclosure was proceeding without delay. They had exactly 24 hours to pack whatever personal belongings could fit into the trunk of their remaining vehicle. If they were not completely off the premises by sunrise tomorrow, Vanguard's private security detail would arrive to physically remove them and permanently change the locks. I did not wait for his response, nor did I listen to the fresh wave of hysterical pleading that began to erupt through the speaker. I severed the connection, placing the phone face down on the glass. The silence that filled my office was profound, heavy, and incredibly sweet. The debt of the past had finally been collected in full. While the silence in my office signaled the definitive end of my parents' reign, a vastly different but equally brutal reckoning was waiting for Jason as the sun rose over the city's financial district. He had spent the night in federal holding, subjected to hours of relentless, aggressive interrogation regarding his signature on Wyatt's fraudulent shell entities. When his high-priced defense attorney finally managed to secure his temporary release pending formal indictment, Jason walked out into the crisp morning air, sincerely believing he could still salvage his career. He was catastrophically mistaken. The contagion of the Obsidian Capital strike had already spread through the city's elite networks with lethal, uncompromising speed. When he arrived at his prestigious law firm, his bespoke suit wrinkled and smelling of stale holding cell coffee, his biometric access card flashed a harsh, unforgiving red at the security turnstile. He did not make it past the marble lobby. 3 senior partners, men who had mentored him and shared expensive scotch with him just days prior, were waiting, flanked by building security. They did not invite him up to his corner office to discuss his options. They handed him a single, heavily redacted termination letter. The firm was executing a scorched earth policy to sever all ties with him, desperate to avoid the toxic federal fallout of the Ponzi scheme. Before he could even formulate a hollow threat regarding wrongful termination, the managing partner handed him a second envelope directly from the State Bar Association. His law license was officially suspended effective immediately pending the outcome of the federal criminal investigation. He was stripped of his livelihood, his prestige, and his professional identity in a matter of seconds, handed a cheap cardboard box containing his personal desk items, and escorted out the revolving doors by armed guards. Panic, raw and unadulterated, finally pierced through Jason's legendary arrogance. He stood on the bustling pavement as the morning commute swirled indifferently around him. Every single avenue of escape had been systematically annihilated. His offshore accounts were legally inaccessible, frozen tight by the divorce proceedings initiated by Monique. He could not run to our parents for a bailout. He already knew their assets had been vaporized and their estate was actively facing foreclosure. His credit cards were declining. His reputation was toxic waste, and the very real threat of federal prison loomed over him like an executioner's axe. Driven by sheer, gnawing desperation, he resorted to his only remaining play. He needed cash, and he needed a savior. He convinced himself that Monique, despite her dramatic exit at the gala, was inherently soft. He believed he could leverage 12 years of marriage, manipulate her emotions, and talk his way into a temporary financial lifeline. He tracked her down using a location-sharing application on his phone that she had not yet bothered to disable, following the digital breadcrumbs to the heart of the city's newly developed technology sector. He found her stepping out of a towering, ultra-modern building, composed entirely of black glass and brushed steel. The visual contrast between them was staggering. Jason looked haggard, wild-eyed, and sweating through his ruined suit. Monique looked like a reigning monarch. She wore a tailored, razor-sharp charcoal blazer, her posture immaculate, projecting an aura of immense, untouchable authority. He rushed toward her, his voice a frantic, grating whine, completely abandoning his polished corporate dignity. He grabbed her arm, launching into a pathetic, rambling monologue on the sidewalk. He blamed Wyatt for tricking him, he blamed the federal agents for overreacting, and he begged her to unfreeze the trust fund just long enough to secure him a decent criminal defense attorney and a hotel room. He pleaded with her to remember their vows, to show him a shred of mercy in his darkest hour. Monique calmly reached down and peeled his trembling fingers off her sleeve as if discarding a piece of lint. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at him with hatred, sorrow, or any lingering affection. She looked at him with the absolute chilling indifference of a stranger observing a fascinating insect. She smoothed the fabric of her blazer and delivered the revelation that would permanently break his spirit. She informed him that she had absolutely no intention of accessing her trust fund to save a sinking ship. She simply did not need to. She gestured casually to the towering black skyscraper behind her, the secondary corporate hub for Vanguard Defense Logistics. She stated with crystal-clear articulation that she had just formally accepted the position of Vice President of Human Resources. The blood drained entirely from Jason's face as the architectural geometry of his destruction finally locked into place. He staggered backward, the breath violently knocked from his lungs. The woman he had constantly belittled as a mere corporate accessory was now a commanding executive. And her boss, the CEO, who had personally recruited her and orchestrated this entire financial bloodbath, was the very sister he had mocked, discarded, and tried to throw onto the streets. He realized, with crushing, absolute finality, that Monique and I held every single card, every dollar, and all the power. Monique turned her back on his gaping, silent horror and walked gracefully toward a waiting black car, leaving him completely alone and exposed on the busy sidewalk. Hours later, as a cold, driving rain began to wash over the city, Jason found himself standing at the scarred laminate reception desk of a decaying neon-lit motel miles outside the city limits. He paid for a single night using the last crumpled bills he had managed to scrounge from his wallet. He dragged his cardboard box of office supplies down a flickering, mold-scented corridor and unlocked the door to a grimy, damp room. He sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, listening to the rain beat against the thin, cracked window pane. He was entirely broke, legally radioactive, and utterly isolated. He had been forcefully displaced into the exact kind of squalid, desperate nightmare he had so arrogantly tried to force upon me. The relentless storm that battered the thin, cracked window pane of Jason's squalid motel room also swept across the exclusive, heavily gated enclaves of the city's old money elite. Among the sprawling properties lashed by the freezing rain was the heavily fortified compound belonging to Sydney's father. He was a ruthless commercial real estate magnate who valued his pristine corporate balance sheets and spotless tax records far more than any concept of paternal loyalty or unconditional love. Sydney, having been forced to abandon her federally confiscated luxury sports car at the gala, had managed to secure a humiliating ride to her family's private gates, fully expecting her father to unleash his army of high-priced fixers to clean up the catastrophic mess she had stumbled into. She burst into his expansive mahogany-paneled study, drenched, shivering, and completely hysterical, demanding a blank check and an immediate deployment of elite white-collar defense attorneys. Instead of offering a sympathetic embrace or a comforting word, she was met with a cold, impenetrable wall of corporate self-preservation. Her father had spent 4 decades carefully navigating tax loopholes and aggressively avoiding any form of federal scrutiny. The exact moment the news broke that his daughter was explicitly linked to the epicenter of the largest financial fraud in the state and actively in possession of millions of dollars in stolen assets, he panicked violently. He was absolutely terrified that the radioactive fallout from Wyatt's highly publicized implosion would serve as a beacon to the IRS, triggering a massive forensic audit of his own heavily shielded holding companies. He did not offer her a glass of water or a place to sleep. Operating purely on a primal instinct to protect his own wealth, he immediately froze. Her trust fund revoked her platinum credit cards and explicitly barred her from the property. He coldly and methodically informed her that she was a toxic liability, a walking federal subpoena, and that she was entirely on her own. Stripped of her lifelong safety net and fueled by a blinding entitled rage, Sydney directed her unhinged fury at the only target she felt she could still intimidate. The following afternoon, bypassing any subtle discretion or legal approach, she physically stormed the lobby of Vanguard Defense Logistics. She managed to slip past the initial layer of reception by trailing a large group of visiting executives, her designer heels clicking frantically against the polished granite floor as she bypassed the primary visitor checkpoint. She marched straight toward the restricted elevator banks, screaming my name with a shrill, piercing intensity that halted the entire ground floor staff in their tracks. By slipping through closing doors, she managed to ride a secure employee elevator up to the executive suite before the building's internal security grid fully locked her down. She burst through the heavy, frosted glass doors of my outer office wild-eyed and manic. Her expensive salon blowout was ruined from the humidity, her makeup smeared and her face twisted in a mask of absolute spoiled desperation. She bypassed my stunned executive assistant and stormed into my private sanctuary, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. She demanded that I fix the nightmare I had created, screaming that I had maliciously ruined her flawless reputation and stolen her glittering future. She slammed her hands down on the edge of my desk, violently demanding that I give her back her life. I did not even dignify her hysterical, unhinged entrance by standing up. I remained perfectly still, leaning back comfortably in my ergonomic leather chair, an expression of profound, bored indifference resting easily on my face. I did not raise my voice, offer a single word of explanation, or provide the screaming match she so desperately craved. I simply maintained absolute eye contact and pressed a silent silver button mounted flush under the rim of my desk. Within seconds, 2 massive, heavily armored Vanguard security contractors materialized behind her, their dark tactical gear providing a stark, intimidating contrast to her ruined silk blouse. They did not politely ask her to lower her voice or step outside. They simply flanked her, clamped their heavy gloved hands firmly over her shaking shoulders, and lifted her completely off her feet. Sydney thrashed wildly, kicking her legs in the air, hurling a string of violent, breathless obscenities as they carried her backward out of my office. Her desperate, shrill voice echoed down the long carpeted corridor, fading slowly into a pathetic, exhausted whine as the heavy steel elevator doors sealed her fate. As the muffled sound of her forced extraction vanished entirely, returning my office to a state of perfect absolute tranquility, I casually uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen. I pulled a thick, leather-bound portfolio toward the center of my blotter, smoothed the crisp parchment, and smoothly signed my name to a $50 million international defense logistics contract, turning the page on her existence without a second thought. The reality of federal asset seizure is not a swift, dramatic, cinematic conclusion. It is a slow, grinding, and deeply humiliating process of total attrition. Weeks after her dramatic ejection from my corporate headquarters, the severe legal consequences of Sydney's illicit windfall finally caught up with her. The federal authorities had systematically identified, tracked, and clawed back every single piece of diamond jewelry, every limited edition designer handbag, and every luxury asset purchased with Carolyn's stolen, secretly liquidated retirement funds. Furthermore, Sydney was now facing mounting aggressive criminal charges for the willful receipt of stolen property. This brutal legal battle required an astronomical retainer fee from any defense attorney willing to take on a case so deeply intertwined with a massive federal fraud investigation. With her father's vast wealth completely inaccessible and her fraudulent benefactor sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary awaiting trial, she was violently forced to confront the harsh, unforgiving realities of the working-class civilian world she had always sneered at. I saw her one last time purely by chance while cutting through a mid-tier suburban shopping mall on my way to a regional logistics briefing. She was standing behind the laminated counter of a fast fashion retail kiosk, bathed in the unflattering glare of cheap fluorescent lighting. She was wearing a stiff polyester uniform shirt that was 2 sizes too big, a stark contrast to the custom-tailored silks she used to parade around the country club. The heavy, multi-million-dollar diamond parure had been replaced by a cheap plastic name tag pinned crookedly to her chest. She was meticulously folding a stack of heavily discounted cotton t-shirts, forced to work back-to-back minimum wage shifts, just to make the fractional, agonizing payments on her crippling legal defense bills. I watched as a rude customer snapped their fingers at her demanding a different size, and saw the exact moment her spirit broke. She was permanently trapped in a relentless, grueling cycle of manual retail labor to pay the ultimate price for the extravagant stolen life she had so arrogantly flaunted. The total collapse of Sydney's heavily subsidized reality was merely a footnote to the overarching corporate siege I had meticulously engineered. The true architect of the devastating multi-million-dollar fraud was still waiting for his final personal reckoning. Wyatt had been languishing in the stark, unforgiving confines of a maximum security federal detention center for weeks, denied bail during his initial arraignment due to the overwhelming flight risk he presented. The Department of Justice had completely dismantled his firm, freezing every known asset, domestic and offshore, effectively trapping him in a concrete cage. For a month, I ignored the frantic, pathetic messages he relayed through his increasingly desperate court-appointed public defender. I let him marinate in the terrifying reality of his new existence. But when the formal, desperate request for a face-to-face visitor physically crossed my desk at Vanguard headquarters, I decided to grant him exactly one final audience. I did not go to offer comfort, and I certainly did not go to offer salvation. I went to sever the absolute last tether, connecting me to the man I had once mistakenly trusted. The federal lockup was a bleak, imposing fortress of poured concrete and razor wire, radiating an atmosphere of industrialized despair. The air inside the facility was thick with the scent of harsh chemical bleach, stale sweat, and absolute hopelessness. I moved through the rigorous security checkpoints with calm, practiced efficiency, surrendering my identification and passing through heavy metal detectors. I had dressed for the occasion with deliberate surgical precision. I wore a pristine, impeccably tailored white wool crepe suit completely devoid of any wrinkles or flaws, projecting an aura of absolute, untouchable authority. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless chignon, and my posture was immaculate. I was escorted down a long, sterile corridor, lined with heavy steel doors, my designer heels clicking rhythmically against the scuffed linoleum floor, a sharp, commanding sound that cut through the muffled groans of the detention center. The guard directed me into a cramped, aggressively illuminated visitation room, divided precisely in half by a thick, scratched wall of bulletproof acrylic glass. I took a seat in the hard plastic chair, folded my hands neatly in my lap, and waited for the ghost of my past to materialize. The heavy steel door on the opposite side of the glass clanged open, and Wyatt was marched into the small cubicle by an armed corrections officer. The physical deterioration was staggering. The polished, arrogant titan of the financial district had been entirely erased. The expensive custom-tailored Italian suits had been replaced by a baggy, violently orange canvas jumpsuit that swallowed his suddenly frail frame. His perpetually styled hair was greasy and unkempt. His skin carried a sickly, fluorescent pallor, and dark bruised bags hung heavily beneath his frantic, bloodshot eyes. He looked exactly like what he truly was, a cornered, desperate criminal stripped of his illusions. He practically threw himself into the plastic chair on his side of the partition and snatched the heavy black telephone receiver from its metal cradle with shaking hands. I picked up my receiver, slowly bringing the cool plastic to my ear, but I did not utter a single syllable. Wyatt pressed his free hand flat against the thick glass, his chest heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. He instantly turned on the old familiar charm, attempting to deploy the very same toxic manipulation he had used to deceive me and 100 billionaire investors for years. The tears flowed immediately, hot and fast, streaming down his pale cheeks in a theatrical display of manufactured remorse. He begged me for forgiveness, his voice a frantic, grating whine that crackled through the cheap speaker of the telephone. He admitted that he knew everything now that his public defender had explained the terrifying scope of Obsidian Capital and Vanguard Defense Logistics. He looked at me with wild, desperate awe, praising my brilliance, pleading with me to use my hidden corporate empire to secure his release. The federal magistrate had set his bail at an astronomical punitive number, and I was the only person on Earth with the liquid capital required to free him. He completely and unapologetically threw his mistress under the bus, claiming that Sydney meant absolutely nothing to him. He sobbed, insisting she was a hollow, stupid distraction, a terrible mistake born of corporate stress, and that I, Blair, had always been his one true love. He promised we could start over. He promised that we could rebuild our lives together if I would just wire the funds and save him from the nightmare of federal prison. I listened to his entire pathetic monologue without blinking. My expression remained a mask of absolute chilling indifference. I let his desperate pleas bounce harmlessly off the reinforced glass, entirely immune to his toxic charisma. When he finally ran out of breath, pausing to gasp for air and await my saving grace, I moved. I reached smoothly into my sleek leather briefcase and retrieved a single thick manila folder. I did not speak to him. I simply slid the heavy envelope through the narrow metal exchange slot located at the base of the acrylic partition. Wyatt dropped the phone receiver, letting it dangle by its coiled metal cord, and practically tore the folder open, his eyes wide with the desperate, delusional hope that I had brought him Vanguard corporate checks or bail bond authorizations. Instead, his trembling hands pulled out the final, highly expedited divorce decree, freshly stamped and heavily embossed by the state Supreme Court. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse, as his bloodshot eyes scanned the bold, undeniable legal judgments. The document was a masterpiece of corporate law and aggressive asset protection. Because every single dollar on Wyatt's side of the ledger was criminally tainted and actively seized by the federal government under aggressive fraud statutes, the presiding judge had granted me 100% of our remaining legitimate marital assets to satisfy my equitable distribution rights. I kept the real estate, the clean investment portfolios, and the untainted cash reserves. Wyatt was legally awarded absolutely nothing. Even worse, the decree explicitly stipulated that he and he alone was solely and entirely responsible for the massive multi-million-dollar criminal restitution debt owed to his defrauded victims. He was financially chained to a colossal, impossible mountain of debt that he would carry for the rest of his miserable life, all from the inside of a concrete cell. The absolute finality of his total destruction dawned on him in real time. His jaw went slack and the papers fluttered from his shaking hands, scattering across the small metal counter. He reached frantically for the dangling phone receiver, opening his mouth to beg, to scream, to somehow negotiate terms with a woman who had already conquered the board. I did not give him the satisfaction of a parting word. I placed my black phone receiver firmly back onto its metal cradle, permanently cutting off his audio feed. I stood up, smoothed the lapels of my immaculate white suit, and turned my back on him. Through the thick, soundproof glass, I could see his face contort in absolute, terrifying despair. He slammed his fists violently against the acrylic partition, his mouth wide open, screaming my name over and over again into the silent void of the visitation booth. I did not look back. I walked steadily down the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor, my heels clicking a sharp, victorious rhythm against the concrete floor, leaving the wreckage of my past locked securely behind me. The pristine silence of the federal visitation room was a world away from the decaying, claustrophobic reality Thomas and Carolyn now occupied. Stripped of their sprawling suburban sanctuary and banished from their elite social circles, my parents had been violently forced to the absolute bottom of the economic food chain. They were currently residing in a cramped, moldy two-bedroom walk-up apartment situated in the grimy industrial shadows of the city's outer rim. The persistent, suffocating scent of damp drywall and cheap cooking oil had permanently replaced the bespoke floral arrangements and imported leather they were accustomed to. Their platinum credit cards were canceled. Their investment portfolios were entirely liquidated by federal asset forfeiture, and their fair-weather friends had universally abandoned them the moment their accounts ran dry. They were surviving on the agonizingly thin margins of heavily garnished Social Security checks, trapped in a squalid, miserable existence that offered no avenue of escape. It was within this depressing, dimly lit apartment that a flickering secondhand television set brought them the news of my latest corporate endeavor. The local broadcast was buzzing with coverage of Vanguard Defense Logistics, hosting a massive, highly publicized charity gala dedicated to funding rehabilitation programs for disabled military veterans. The news anchors spoke breathlessly of the opulent venue, the staggering amount of capital being raised, and my rising status as the city's premier philanthropic executive. Watching their discarded, discredited daughter bathed in the glamorous glow of flashbulbs and adulation sparked a desperate, venomous idea in their minds. Bereft of high-priced attorneys or financial leverage, they decided to resort to the only weapon they had left: emotional manipulation. They calculated that a high-profile corporate figure's greatest vulnerability was public optics. If they could successfully corner me in front of the press corps, weeping and pleading for a tearful family reconciliation, they believed the intense media pressure would force me to embrace them and open my checkbook to protect my brand. It was a pathetic, transparent strategy, heavily relying on the very societal norms and familial guilt they had mercilessly weaponized against me for my entire life. They meticulously ironed their best remaining garments, desperate to mask their glaring destitution under a thin, fraying veneer of fading aristocratic grace, and purchased a bus ticket to the downtown Civic Center. The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of orchestrated elegance, crawling with aggressive journalists, local politicians, and decorated military brass. It was the absolute perfect stage for their desperate theatrical performance. By tailgating a large group of arriving donors, they managed to slip past the distracted perimeter guards and blend into the opulent crowd, their eyes frantically scanning the room for their target. I was standing near the edge of the main stage, engaged in a quiet, high-level conversation with a retired four-star general, the ambient glow of the crystal chandeliers reflecting off my tailored evening gown. My private security detail noticed the intrusion immediately. The lead contractor tapped his earpiece, caught my eye from across the room, and silently asked for authorization to intercept and remove the uninvited guests. I did not flinch, and I did not panic. I simply raised a single, commanding finger, silently ordering my tactical team to stand down and hold their positions. I watched calmly from the corner of my eye as Thomas and Carolyn aggressively pushed their way to the very front of the press barricade. Right on cue, exactly as the local news cameras pivoted to capture the commotion, Carolyn unleashed a loud theatrical sob that cut through the sophisticated chatter of the ballroom. She reached out her trembling hands toward me, crying my name with manufactured anguish. She wailed to the surrounding reporters about how much they missed their little girl, how worried sick they had been about my military injuries, and how they just wanted their beautiful family back together. Thomas stood rigidly beside her, his head bowed, looking broken and contrite, playing the role of the doting, worried parents to absolute perfection. The journalists immediately swarmed the barricade, their microphones extended and cameras flashing, sensing a viral, highly emotional human interest story unfolding live on the red carpet. They waited breathlessly for the wealthy CEO to break down and rush into the loving arms of her estranged family. Instead of calling for security to physically drag them away, a move that would have instantly painted me as the callous, heartless corporate villain they desperately wanted the world to see. I smiled. I stepped gracefully away from the general, walked directly up the short staircase onto the main stage, and calmly detached the microphone from the podium. The entire ballroom fell into a sudden, breathless hush, the silence punctuated only by the rapid clicking of camera shutters. I looked directly down at my weeping parents, the brilliant spotlights reflecting in my cold eyes, and spoke with a voice full of profound, carefully manufactured warmth. I announced to the captivated room, and to the live broadcast feeds transmitting across the state, that I was incredibly grateful my parents had made the difficult journey to be here tonight. I told the audience that Vanguard Defense Logistics was fundamentally built on the core military values of relentless resilience and brutal survival, and that absolutely no one had taught me those vital lessons better than Thomas and Carolyn. I leaned into the microphone, my voice ringing clear, lethal, and absolute. I stated that I wanted to thank them for teaching me the harshest lesson of my life, that true independence means relying on no one. The effect was instantaneous, spectacular, and utterly devastating. The narrative violently snapped back on them with the force of a physical blow. The press corps did not see a tragic family estrangement. They saw the ultimate triumphant origin story of a disabled combat veteran who had conquered her heartless abusers to build a corporate empire. The journalists instantly turned their lenses back on my parents, capturing their stunned, open-mouthed horror as their manipulative ambush completely disintegrated on live television. The press ate it up as a wildly inspirational veteran story of overcoming adversity. The applause from the military brass and corporate titans was deafening, a roaring wave of validation that drowned out Carolyn's frantic, panicked attempts to change the story. With the public optics completely secured and my absolute victory televised, I gave a subtle, definitive nod to the Vanguard tactical team. Two massive security contractors materialized flawlessly beside my parents, gripping their elbows with uncompromising bruising force. They were swiftly and silently escorted out the service exit, banished back into the damp, unforgiving city night, thoroughly defeated, and publicly humiliated by the very spotlight they had tried to weaponize against me. The swift, brutal efficiency of my parents' public disgrace was merely the prelude to the final physical dismantling of their world. With their utter defeat cemented in the local press and their remaining credibility reduced to ashes, the lingering legal formalities regarding their foreclosed property moved with accelerated, uncompromising precision. Obsidian Capital, acting under my direct authorization, finalized the absolute seizure of the sprawling suburban estate. The heavily leveraged mortgage was officially dissolved, the local municipal records were aggressively updated, and the deed was transferred entirely into the secure holding accounts of Vanguard Defense Logistics. I did not intend to flip the property for a lucrative corporate profit, nor did I plan to lease it out to another generation of arrogant, hollow socialites. The mansion was a rotting monument to a toxic childhood, a physical manifestation of my parents' manufactured superiority and bottomless cruelty. It was a structure infused with decades of emotional poison, and it needed to be entirely eradicated. 2 weeks after the spectacular implosion at the charity gala, the affluent, meticulously manicured silence of that elite neighborhood was violently interrupted. I did not arrive in a sleek, inconspicuous executive town car to quietly inspect my new real estate asset. I arrived at the head of a massive, thundering convoy of heavy industrial machinery. A fleet of Vanguard-branded bulldozers, heavy excavators, and armored dump trucks rumbled down the pristine, tree-lined avenues, their massive diesel engines shaking the perfectly landscaped lawns and rattling the expensive leaded windows of the neighboring mansions. The wealthy residents, former peers of Thomas and Carolyn, who had eagerly participated in their toxic social climbing, peeked through their expensive silk curtains in sheer, unadulterated horror as the line of yellow and black construction vehicles breached the high iron gates of my parents' former sanctuary. I stepped out of the lead transport vehicle wearing steel-toed boots, dark denim, and a high-visibility Vanguard jacket. The air was crisp, holding the faint scent of pine and morning dew, a sharp, invigorating contrast to the heavy smell of exhaust and churning diesel fuel. I stood at the base of the circular driveway and looked up at the towering facade of the estate one last time. The towering white columns, the immaculate sweeping landscaping, and the heavy imported stone steps where I had once stood freezing, soaked to the bone, and begging for a single night of shelter, all loomed before me. It was a house built entirely on lies, financed by reckless debt, and maintained by the systematic destruction of anyone they deemed inferior. I felt no nostalgia, no lingering sentimental attachment to the brick and mortar. Every room held a memory of being belittled, dismissed, or ignored. I raised my right hand and gave a sharp, definitive nod to the lead site foreman. The destruction was immediate, deafening, and breathtakingly violent. The first excavator drove its massive steel claw directly through the grand oak front doors, shattering the heavy, ornate wood into jagged, splintered fragments. The crunch of collapsing architecture echoed like artillery fire across the affluent suburb as the bulldozers tore into the primary structural supports. The walls of the grand foyer where my mother had hosted her pretentious, glittering society dinners and judged the worth of her guests by their bank accounts caved inward with a thunderous roar. Massive plumes of thick gray dust billowed into the clear morning sky, raining debris over the pristine driveway. I watched unflinchingly as the heavy machinery systematically ripped the mansion apart piece by piece. The expensive imported Italian marble was crushed into coarse gravel under the heavy steel treads of the excavators. The glittering crystal chandeliers that had once illuminated my parents' absolute arrogance were pulverized under tons of collapsing drywall and shattered slate roofing tiles. The opulent master suite, the formal dining room where my military service was repeatedly mocked as a pathetic failure. The immaculate designer kitchen, every single square foot of their fabricated elitist reality, was reduced to a chaotic, unrecognizable pile of broken timber and twisted rebar. The elite demolition crew worked with ruthless military precision, entirely leveling the sprawling structure before the sun reached its zenith. The physical erasure was absolute and uncompromising. The toxic monument to their fake status was wiped clean from the face of the earth, leaving nothing but a vast, flattened expanse of raw dirt and broken stone. As the thick clouds of dust slowly began to settle over the flattened acreage, I unrolled a large set of architectural blueprints across the hood of my transport vehicle. The freshly cleared earth was not going to remain empty, nor would it ever again host a monument to vanity and greed. In place of the mansion, we were breaking ground on a state-of-the-art Vanguard facility. It would be a comprehensive rehabilitation and tactical training center dedicated exclusively to combat veterans and their service dogs. The complex would feature advanced physical therapy wings, specialized psychiatric support clinics for PTSD trauma recovery, and expansive customized training grounds for military canines. It was a multi-million-dollar corporate investment designed to provide genuine healing, absolute security, and a fiercely loyal community for those who had sacrificed everything for their country. I was taking the poisoned, sterile soil of my childhood trauma and forcefully transforming it into a sanctuary of genuine survival and unconditional support. The very ground where I was once told I was a pathetic, worthless disappointment would now serve as a premier training ground for actual heroes. I did not need to look far to witness the final crushing impact of this architectural rebirth. Parked nearly 2 blocks away, partially concealed beneath the drooping melancholy branches of a weeping willow tree, sat a rusted, heavily dented sedan. Through the high-powered binoculars of my perimeter security detail, the occupant was clearly visible. It was Thomas. He had driven from his squalid, mold-scented apartment on the edge of the city, drawn by some morbid, masochistic compulsion to witness the final, agonizing days of his seized estate. He sat hunched behind the cracked steering wheel, his pale, unshaven face pressed tightly against the smudged window glass, watching as the massive excavators scooped up the shattered, unrecognizable remains of his life and dumped them into the waiting trucks. He saw the heavy Vanguard corporate banners being erected along the perimeter fencing, proudly announcing the incoming Veteran Rehabilitation Center. He watched the absolute physical destruction of everything he had ever valued knowing, with agonizing, suffocating certainty that his name, his high society status, and his entire legacy had been literally and metaphorically ground into dust. I did not send my security contractors to chase him away or intimidate him. I simply let him sit there in the cramped, freezing confines of his ruined reality and watch the heavy machinery pave over his existence. The debt was settled, the total erasure was complete, and the future belonged entirely to the survivors. The debt was settled, the total erasure was complete, and the future belonged entirely to the survivors. Chief among those survivors was Monique. Her integration into the upper echelons of Vanguard Defense Logistics was nothing short of a masterclass in corporate warfare. When I initially brought her into the executive suite, giving her absolute control of our international acquisitions division, a few of the entrenched old guard board members whispered their doubts. They mistakenly read her quiet demeanor and her previous life as a suburban housewife as markers of weakness. Monique systematically dismantled those assumptions within her first 30 days. She did not merely adapt to her new high-pressure role, she conquered it with a terrifying, brilliant efficiency. Stripped of the suffocating gaslighting environment Jason had forced her into, her latent intellect and strategic genius exploded to the surface. She orchestrated a highly complex multinational buyout of a rival logistics firm, navigating the hostile negotiations with a calm, surgical ruthlessness that left the opposing legal teams completely shell-shocked. She was a natural apex predator in the boardroom, commanding absolute respect from the military contractors and delivering record-breaking quarterly profits. Watching her shed the fabricated insecurities of her past and step fully into her power was one of my proudest achievements. To commemorate her astonishing first-year anniversary as a Vanguard executive, I reserved a private dining room at the most exclusive, impenetrable culinary fortress in the city. It was an underground invite-only establishment hidden beneath the financial district, catering exclusively to the ultra-elite. There were no flashing cameras, no desperate socialites, and absolutely no pretense. It was a sanctuary of quiet, unassailable power featuring dimly lit mahogany walls, imported leather booths, and a staff that anticipated every need with silent, flawless precision. We arrived at the restaurant projecting the exact kind of untouchable authority we had both fought so fiercely to build. Monique wore a sleek, razor-sharp emerald silk suit that commanded attention, her posture radiating absolute confidence, while I wore a minimalist, impeccably tailored charcoal blazer. The host greeted us by name, immediately ushering us past the heavy velvet curtains and into our secluded alcove. Over plates of seared wagyu and delicate truffled sea bass, the conversation shifted away from our current global supply chain logistics and drifted toward the burning wreckage of the lives we had deliberately left behind. Monique took a slow, deliberate sip from her crystal water glass, a wicked, triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She reached into her designer clutch and produced a single neatly folded legal document, sliding it across the pristine white tablecloth toward me. It was a formal court transcript, and the details printed on the heavy bond paper were absolutely exquisite. Jason, entirely bankrupt and desperate after being permanently blacklisted from the tech industry, had attempted one final pathetic maneuver. He had retained a bottom-feeding, contingency-based lawyer and actually tried to sue Monique for spousal support and exorbitant alimony. He had argued to the court that he was entitled to a percentage of her new astronomical Vanguard salary to maintain the lifestyle he had grown accustomed to before his humiliating termination. It was a breathtaking display of delusional entitlement. Monique leaned across the table, her eyes sparkling with unadulterated joy, and recounted the absolute massacre that had taken place in the civil courtroom just 2 days prior. She had not even needed to deploy Vanguard's elite corporate legal team. The presiding judge had taken one look at Jason's petition and practically laughed him out of the chamber. But the true masterpiece of the hearing was the timing. Right as Jason's discount attorney was launching into a desperate plea for equitable distribution, 2 federal agents had quietly entered the back of the courtroom. The judge threw the alimony case out with prejudice, explicitly citing the fact that Jason's financial disclosures were entirely fraudulent. The federal prosecutors had just unsealed a massive 70-count indictment against him for systemic wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. Jason was physically detained the moment he stepped out of the civil court, his hands roughly cuffed behind his back in the public hallway. He was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, facing a mandatory minimum of 30 years in a maximum security penitentiary. He had tried to extract money from the woman he had abused, and instead he had walked directly into a federal trap that would effectively end his life. We savored the story, dissecting every miserable detail of his total downfall. There was no pity, no lingering sadness, and absolutely no remorse. We ordered a bottle of the restaurant's oldest, most incredibly rare vintage champagne. The sommelier poured the sparkling golden liquid into our crystal flutes with quiet reverence, then vanished into the shadows, leaving us alone in our private victory. I raised my glass, the crystal catching the ambient light of the room. I looked across the table at Monique, seeing not just a brilliant corporate strategist or a highly valuable executive, but a woman who had walked through the exact same fire that had tried to consume me. We toasted to absolute, uncompromising loyalty. We toasted to the exhilarating, unmatched power of walking away from toxic parasitic systems designed to drain us of our worth. Most importantly, we raised our glasses to the unbreakable strength of women who looked at the victim's narrative society, handed them, tore it to shreds, and chose to become conquerors instead. The clink of our glasses rang out like a final victorious bell. As we drank, a profound, unshakable realization settled deep within my chest. I had spent my entire life desperately seeking validation from a family that only viewed me as an exploitable resource or a convenient punching bag. I had bled for their approval only to be met with relentless betrayal. But looking at Monique, feeling the absolute ironclad trust and mutual respect that flowed between us, I knew the search was permanently over. We were not bound by genetics or forced proximity. We were bound by shared survival, brutal honesty, and an empire we had built with our own hands. In the quiet, luxurious aftermath of our total victory, I realized I had finally found the real, unwavering family I had always wanted. The profound, unshakable peace I had secured during that celebratory dinner with Monique became my absolute armor for the final, inevitable confrontation. The months leading up to the sentencing hearing had been a whirlwind of aggressive corporate expansion and relentless forward momentum for Vanguard Defense Logistics, completely isolating me from the decaying remnants of the people who had once tried to destroy me. When the designated Tuesday morning finally arrived, the sky over the city was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a stark contrast to the heavy, oppressive atmosphere waiting inside the United States District Court. I bypassed the chaotic, swarming media circus camped on the front steps by utilizing a secure underground entrance, a discreet privilege arranged by the federal prosecutors who viewed me as their most unassailable star witness. The federal courtroom was a cavernous, imposing fortress of polished mahogany, dark leather, and heavy judicial authority. It smelled faintly of lemon wax and aged paper, an environment meticulously designed to strip away arrogance and project absolute, inescapable consequence. I took my designated seat in the very front row of the gallery, positioned directly behind the prosecutor's table, projecting an aura of total, untouchable serenity. At my immediate side, settling comfortably onto the cool hardwood floor with a soft sigh, was Duke. My massive, brilliantly trained German Shepherd service dog had been my silent, steadfast shadow through the darkest, most agonizing days of my physical rehabilitation, and it was only fitting that he was here to witness the absolute conclusion of the war. I rested my hand lightly on his broad head, feeling the steady, calming rhythm of his breathing. The expansive gallery slowly filled behind me, the heavy oak pews creaking under the weight of defrauded investors, sharp-eyed journalists, and curious legal spectators. I did not turn my head, but I did not need to. I could feel the distinct hollow presence of the two figures huddled in the very back row. Thomas and Carolyn had somehow managed to navigate public transit to attend the spectacle of their former golden boy's ultimate demise. Through the faint reflection of the polished brass railing separating the gallery from the well, I caught a fleeting glimpse of my parents. The physical and psychological deterioration was staggering. They looked incredibly aged, withered down to the bone by the crushing, inescapable stress of their absolute bankruptcy and total public exile. The bespoke tailored designer suits and imported silk dresses they had once wielded like weapons had been entirely replaced by threadbare, mismatched garments that hung loosely on their shrinking frames. Their postures, once rigidly arrogant and dripping with manufactured elitist superiority, were now slumped, fearful, and utterly defeated. They sat pressed tightly together in the dim shadows near the exit, two broken, irrelevant ghosts haunting the absolute margins of a society that had completely and mercilessly expelled them. They were entirely erased from the board, and looking at their reflected misery, I felt nothing but a cold, clinical, and permanent indifference. A heavy steel side door groaned open, and the bailiff's voice boomed, instructing the room to rise. Wyatt was marched into the chamber, tightly flanked by two massive, heavily armed United States Marshals. If his appearance in the visitation booth months ago had been shocking, his current state was a portrait of total, irreversible ruin. The harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lighting of the courtroom highlighted the deep, gaunt, sickly hollows of his cheeks and the thinning, unkempt gray hair he had once obsessed over styling. His violently orange canvas prison jumpsuit swallowed his emaciated frame, and the heavy iron chains connecting his wrists to his waist clanked with a pathetic rhythmic finality as he shuffled toward the defense table. He did not dare look back at the gallery. He kept his bloodshot, terrified eyes fixed firmly on the polished wood of the table, entirely stripped of his toxic charisma, his aggressive bravado, and his manipulative charm. He was a cornered, terrified animal facing the slaughter. The presiding federal judge, a stern, uncompromising magistrate, with a legendary reputation for possessing zero tolerance for predatory white-collar criminals, took the elevated bench and initiated the final proceedings. The sentencing phase was not a debate. It was a brutal, meticulous, and agonizingly slow recounting of Wyatt's systemic treachery. The lead federal prosecutor stood and laid out the staggering, irrefutable scope of the devastation, detailing the multi-million-dollar wire fraud schemes, the aggressive, calculated corporate embezzlement, and the sprawling criminal conspiracy deliberately designed to defraud honest, hard-working investors while simultaneously attempting to exploit and destroy his own wife. The judge listened with a mask of absolute, undisguised disgust. When Wyatt's exhausted public defender offered a weak, pathetic, half-hearted plea for leniency, citing first-time offenses and a completely fabricated display of remorse, the judge cut him off with a razor-sharp, humiliating reprimand that silenced the entire room. Then came the absolute, undeniable judgment. The judge looked down from the bench, his voice echoing like a physical blow through the cavernous chamber. He addressed Wyatt not as a fallen financial titan or a misguided executive, but as a cowardly, parasitic predator who had systematically destroyed lives for his own insatiable, pathetic greed. The sentence was delivered with a crushing, irrevocable weight: 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Furthermore, the judge explicitly and firmly stipulated that due to the egregious nature of the financial crimes and the lack of genuine cooperation, the sentence would carry absolutely no chance of early parole, probation, or good time reductions. every single day of those 15 years would be served behind concrete and razor wire. The sharp, definitive crack of the wooden gavel hitting the sounding block sealed Wyatt's fate forever. The sound ricocheted off the mahogany walls, a profound echoing punctuation mark on a decade of relentless lies and toxic manipulation. Wyatt visibly collapsed inward, a strangled, pathetic sob escaping his throat as his legs gave out. The marshals immediately grabbed his arms, hauling him upright and dragging his sobbing, broken form toward the holding cells to begin his new, miserable existence. In the back of the room, Carolyn buried her face in her hands, weeping openly, her final desperate connection to her fabricated high society dreams, officially and permanently incarcerated. I did not gloat. I did not turn around to sneer at my ruined parents, nor did I offer a parting glance of triumph toward the weeping man who had tried to bury me alive. I felt no burning need for a dramatic exit or a theatrical display of victory. I was entirely fundamentally at peace. I stood up smoothly, adjusting the lapels of my dark, immaculate blazer with calm precision. Duke rose instantly, his highly intelligent eyes locked onto my subtle hand signals, pressing his warm, solid weight reassuringly against my leg. I turned and walked steadily down the center aisle, my posture perfectly straight, my footsteps silent against the heavy carpet. I moved purposefully toward the heavy oak doors, pushed them open and stepped out into the brilliant, unfiltered sunlight, leaving the wreckage, the betrayals and the ghosts of my past locked securely behind me forever. The brilliant, unfiltered sunlight that had greeted me on the courthouse steps felt entirely different 6 months later, as it washed over the pristine, sprawling campus of the Vanguard Veteran Rehabilitation and Canine Training Center. The bitter, frozen winter of my past had officially thawed into a vibrant, undeniable spring, where a suffocating, ostentatious monument to my parents' manufactured vanity once stood an architectural masterpiece of healing and purpose, now commanded the landscape. The dark, oppressive mahogany and imported marble of my childhood trauma had been entirely replaced by soaring walls of reinforced glass, sustainable steel beams, and warm natural timber. The facility was meticulously designed to breathe, to invite the light in, and to foster an environment of absolute transparency and growth. It was opening day, and the freshly paved circular driveway, once exclusively reserved for toxic socialites and hollow corporate climbers, was currently filled with mobile broadcasting units, city officials, and dozens of decorated military veterans. I stood at the center of the grand entryway, the massive red ribbon stretching taut across the polished front doors. Duke sat at perfect attention by my left side, his highly intelligent eyes scanning the bustling crowd with calm professional vigilance. I wore a tailored deep navy crepe suit, projecting an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. This was not a moment for flashy arrogance or the kind of desperate, attention-seeking spectacle my mother would have orchestrated to feed her fragile ego. This was a solemn, triumphant transfer of power back to the people who actually deserved it. The city mayor delivered a brief, enthusiastic speech praising Vanguard Defense Logistics for our unprecedented corporate philanthropy and our unwavering commitment to the city's disabled servicemen and women. The press corps, the very same journalists who had eagerly documented the dramatic downfall of my family, now captured the birth of my legacy, their camera shutters clicking in a continuous rhythmic wave. As the mayor concluded his remarks and handed me the oversized ceremonial scissors, I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw Monique standing in the front row, a proud, brilliant smile illuminating her features, representing the ironclad corporate sisterhood we had forged in the fires of our respective betrayals. I saw the faces of the initial intake class of veterans, men and women bearing the visible and invisible scars of their service, standing tall and proud alongside their newly paired service dogs. I did not give a long, self-indulgent speech. I simply looked directly into the camera lenses, thanked the community for their unwavering support, and stated that true strength is never measured by what you can destroy, but by what you possess the power to rebuild. With a swift, decisive motion, I sliced through the thick red ribbon. The crowd erupted into deafening applause, and the heavy glass doors automatically slid open, welcoming the public into the sanctuary we had created. The subsequent reception was held in the facility's expansive central atrium, a beautiful sunlit space filled with therapeutic greenery and the low, comforting murmur of running water from a central stone fountain. Caterers moved seamlessly through the crowd with silver trays, while reporters conducted quiet, respectful interviews with the Vanguard executive team. I navigated the room with Duke, shaking hands with local politicians and accepting the heartfelt gratitude of the incoming medical staff. However, the true measure of my victory was not the media adulation or the architectural triumph. It arrived quietly, avoiding the flashing cameras, in the form of a small, unassuming group of elderly men and women gathered near the perimeter of the atrium. I excused myself from a conversation with a city councilman and walked over to them. These were not military veterans or corporate investors. They were Wyatt's former clients, the hardworking, vulnerable people he had systematically targeted, manipulated, and ruthlessly drained of their life savings to fund his extravagant lifestyle. During the chaotic fallout of Wyatt's arrest and the subsequent freezing of his tainted assets, these individuals had faced total catastrophic ruin. The federal government's restitution process would have taken a decade if it yielded anything at all, leaving them destitute and terrified in their twilight years. That was a completely unacceptable outcome. Utilizing the vast, untainted liquid capital of Obsidian Capital, I had quietly directed my elite legal team to establish an anonymous, heavily shielded victims' compensation fund. Long before Wyatt even stepped into that federal courtroom for his sentencing, Vanguard had quietly and discreetly made every single one of his civilian victims financially whole. An elderly woman with soft silver hair and a gentle, trembling smile stepped forward from the group. She reached out and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. She did not know the exact corporate mechanics of the anonymous fund, nor did she care about the complex legal maneuvering it had required to route the money cleanly. She only knew that the devastating financial nightmare she had been plunged into had miraculously vanished overnight, and she possessed the sharp intuition to know exactly who was responsible. She looked into my eyes, her own brimming with profound, unfiltered gratitude, and thanked me softly. She spoke of the absolute terror of losing her retirement, the suffocating fear of losing her home, and the overwhelming, life-saving relief of finding her accounts entirely restored. The others in the group nodded in silent agreement, their faces reflecting a profound peace that mirrored my own. I held her hand, gently offering a quiet, sincere smile. I told her that she never had to worry about shadows or predators ever again. I explained that the people who built their empires on the backs of the vulnerable would always eventually crumble, but those who stood their ground and protected the innocent would endure. In that quiet, unassuming moment away from the glare of the media and the applause of the politicians, the final lingering thread of the conflict was permanently severed. I had not merely conquered the board and destroyed the corrupt forces that had tried to consume me. I had actively shielded the innocent collateral damage from the fallout, proving my ultimate superiority, not just in raw corporate power, but in fundamental character. As the reception slowly wound down, and the guests began to filter out into the warm afternoon air, I stood alone in the center of the atrium with Duke. The wreckage of my past, the toxic manipulations of my parents, and the venomous betrayals of my ex-husband had been entirely neutralized, paved over, and replaced with something beautiful and enduring. I looked up at the sunlight streaming through the massive skylights, feeling the absolute, unshakable certainty of my path forward. The war was officially over. The victory was absolute, and my empire was secure. The war was officially over, the victory was absolute, and my empire was secure. The following week settled into a rhythm of unprecedented, frictionless productivity. Vanguard Defense Logistics operated like a perfectly tuned, unstoppable machine, entirely free from the parasitic drag of my former life. I spent my days in the sleek, heavily fortified executive suite on the top floor of our downtown headquarters, orchestrating global supply chain movements and multinational acquisitions with a clear, unburdened mind. The security protocols for my personal and professional correspondence were notoriously rigorous, designed to isolate and eliminate threats before they ever reached my desk. Every digital inquiry corporate courier package and physical document passed through a multi-tiered filtration system managed by elite security personnel. That was precisely why the sudden appearance of the physical envelope resting on the center of my pristine glass desk was so jarringly anomalous. It had arrived on a dreary, rain-slicked Thursday afternoon, flagged by my executive assistant, merely because it bore a return address from a decaying low-income zip code on the absolute furthest fringes of the city, and was addressed to me in a familiar, jagged scrawl. It was a battered, remarkably cheap paper envelope, the kind sold in bulk at discount convenience stores. It was stained with faint water spots heavily creased at the edges and looked aggressively out of place resting against the polished minimalist surface of my workspace. I did not need to break the seal to recognize the handwriting. The sharp, aggressive cursive leaning heavily to the right with hard, striking loops belonged entirely to Carolyn. It had been nearly a full year since I had last seen her weeping in the dim back row of that federal courtroom, mourning the permanent incarceration of her criminal son and the total humiliating annihilation of her fabricated high society status. I stared at the envelope for a long, silent moment. I waited for the familiar suffocating spike of anxiety that her handwriting used to provoke the involuntary tightening of my chest that had plagued my childhood. It never came. I instructed my assistant to hold all incoming calls, picked up the cheap envelope, and slipped it into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer. It was not a matter for the boardroom. It was a pathetic remnant of a dead life, and it required a highly specific environment for its final absolute disposal. That evening, the city sprawling below my penthouse apartment was a glittering, vibrant tapestry of neon and headlights. Heavy rain lashed rhythmically against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, creating a cocoon of warm, insulated silence within my private sanctuary. I poured myself a heavy measure of a rare, peaty scotch and walked slowly into the expansive sunken living room. Duke padded softly behind me, his claws clicking gently on the imported hardwood before he circled and settled onto the thick woven rug with a deep, contented sigh. I stood before the massive custom-built stone fireplace. The flames cracked and hissed energetically, casting long dancing shadows across the minimalist furniture and the carefully curated artwork adorning the walls. I reached into my jacket, retrieved the crumpled envelope, and cleanly sliced it open with a heavy brass letter opener. The stationery inside was thin, translucent lined notebook paper. It was a sprawling, chaotic manifesto of pure, unfiltered desperation. Carolyn had filled 3 entire pages with a toxic, dizzying mix of fabricated nostalgia, aggressive guilt-tripping, and thinly veiled begging. She wrote at exhausting length about how heavily she was suffering, painting a bleak, miserable picture of her new reality in a squalid, mold-infested apartment complex. She lamented the brutal loss of her affluent friends, her untouchable social standing, and her deeply comfortable existence, entirely and deliberately omitting the fact that those things were built exclusively on systematic fraud and the financial abuse of the elderly. Then came the inevitable sickening pivot. The tone of the ink shifted abruptly from self-pity to entitled delusional demands. She reminded me with heavily underlined strokes of a ballpoint pen that despite everything that had transpired, she was still my mother. She dared to invoke the sacred, unearned concept of family loyalty, insisting that blood inherently required forgiveness. She wrote that it was my fundamental, moral duty as her daughter to rescue her from the devastating consequences of her own horrific actions. The final paragraph was a direct, shameless request for a substantial recurring financial stipend, carefully disguised as a desperate plea for a fresh start so we could supposedly rebuild our shattered relationship and put the past behind us. I stood in the quiet, ambient warmth of my living room and read the letter from beginning to end a second time. 10 years ago, those manipulative words would have utterly devastated me. They would have triggered a paralyzing spiral of self-doubt, a desperate, crushing sense of obligation, and an agonizing manufactured guilt. 5 years ago, they would have ignited a blinding, uncontrollable rage, a furious, burning desire to scream and retaliate against her boundless, suffocating hypocrisy. But as I traced the lines of her desperate, entitled cursive on that cheap paper, I searched the deepest corners of myself for a reaction and found absolutely nothing. There was no blinding anger burning in my chest. There was no lingering sorrow for the supportive mother I never had. There was no shred of residual attachment to the woman who had happily sacrificed my sanity and my future on the altar of her own endless vanity. The emotional void was profound, echoing, and absolute. It was the ultimate, irrefutable proof of my victory. The opposite of love was not hate. It was total clinical indifference. They had permanently lost the power to hurt me, the power to anger me, and the power to demand my attention. Carolyn and Thomas were reduced to nothing more than ink on cheap paper, desperate ghosts shouting into a vast, empty void that simply no longer acknowledged their existence. I did not tear the letter in a fit of dramatic rage. I did not shout or curse her name to the empty room. I stood perfectly still, holding the pages loosely between my steady fingers. With a calm, deliberate, and entirely peaceful motion, I extended my arm and dropped the loose pages directly into the center of the roaring fireplace. The dry, thin paper caught instantly. I watched completely detached as the bright orange flames eagerly consumed the edges of the desperate manifesto. The intense heat blackened the cheap paper, curling the corners aggressively inward before reducing Carolyn's pathetic guilt trips, her arrogant demands, and her desperate pleas into brittle, glowing ash. The fire crackled loudly, breaking the final fragile physical link to my toxic lineage. The heavy smoke drifted up the massive stone chimney, carrying the very last remnants of my abusers out into the cold, stormy night, leaving behind nothing but clean, breathable air. I took a slow, appreciative sip of my scotch, the complex liquid burning pleasantly in the back of my throat. Duke raised his heavy head, his ears perked toward the crackling fire, and I offered him a soft, reassuring smile. The psychological severance was completely and irrevocably finalized. I turned my back on the fireplace, leaving the meaningless ashes to settle in the hearth, and walked toward the sweeping, rain-streaked view of the city, my spirit impossibly light, my mind razor-clear, and my future entirely my own. That night marked the definitive end of the old world, a silent turning of the page that paved the way for the monumental era to come. Now standing on the sweeping cantilevered glass balcony of the Vanguard Defense Logistics Global Headquarters, I breathed in the crisp, unburdened morning air. The relentless rain of that final defining evening had long since washed away, leaving the city skyline gleaming under the brilliant golden light of a new dawn. Far below, the metropolis moved with chaotic, frantic energy, millions of people navigating the labyrinth of their daily lives. From this altitude, 50 stories above the concrete canyons, the noise was reduced to a soft, distant hum. I rested my hands on the cool metal of the railing, feeling the solid, unshakable foundation of the empire I had forged. The sleek, ultra-modern skyscraper was not just a corporate office. It was the physical manifestation of absolute resilience, a towering fortress of industry that cast a long, protective shadow over the financial district. Vanguard had evolved far beyond my initial ambitious projections. We were no longer merely a highly efficient regional player disrupting the supply chain sector. We had become an untouchable global titan. Our logistics networks now spanned multiple continents, coordinating massive, highly classified defense shipments and civilian infrastructure projects with flawless military-grade precision. Every division operated with a ruthless, streamlined excellence, completely devoid of the parasitic nepotism, toxic maneuvering, and hollow vanity that had characterized the empires of my past abusers. Here, power was derived exclusively from merit, intelligence, and unbreakable trust. The boardrooms were sanctuaries of fierce collaborative innovation, driven by executives who understood the true value of loyalty. I had built a sovereign corporate state, completely insulated from the treacherous, shallow society that had once sought to break me. Yet the true crown jewel of this sprawling empire was not the multi-billion-dollar valuation or the impenetrable market dominance. It was the sanctuary thriving miles away on the exact acreage where my childhood trauma had once been rooted. The Vanguard Veteran Rehabilitation and Canine Training Center was operating at peak miraculous capacity. Every week, comprehensive progress reports crossed my desk detailing profound life-altering victories. Men and women who had returned from combat shattered and discarded by the system were finding genuine lasting peace. I read accounts of severely traumatized soldiers taking their first unassisted steps in the advanced physical therapy wings, and I watched video updates of highly trained service dogs executing complex life-saving maneuvers alongside their new handlers. The soil that had once been poisoned by Carolyn and Thomas's bottomless greed and manufactured elitism had been fundamentally purified. It was now generating actual tangible miracles, providing absolute security and a fierce loving community for the innocent and the brave. I had forcefully ripped the narrative from the hands of the corrupt and written a legacy of absolute salvation. This profound transformation extended deeply into my own life, manifesting in the inner circle I now trusted implicitly. I had systematically excised the diseased branches of my biological lineage and deliberately cultivated a chosen family rooted in mutual respect, shared survival, and unconditional support. There were no manipulative guilt trips, no hidden agendas, and no desperate pleas for unearned validation. My circle consisted of warriors, brilliant strategists, and survivors who had walked through their own personal infernos and emerged as polished steel. We protected each other with a quiet, lethal ferocity, bound together by the deep, unspoken understanding that our current peace had been purchased through total, uncompromising victory. The smooth, heavy hum of the reinforced glass balcony door sliding open on its automated tracks broke my quiet reflection. I did not need to turn around to identify the confident, measured footsteps approaching across the polished slate. Monique stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, the crisp wind catching the edge of her impeccably tailored ivory suit. She moved with the predatory grace and absolute assurance of a woman who completely owned her power. There was no trace of the battered, gaslit victim Jason had tried to keep locked in a suburban cage. She was a terrifyingly brilliant executive, my most trusted confidant and the sharpest weapon in Vanguard's corporate arsenal. She walked up to the railing, standing shoulder to shoulder with me, and looked out over the glittering skyline. Without a word, she extended her hand, presenting a thick, heavy leather-bound portfolio. I took it, feeling the satisfying weight of the premium paper inside. It was the finalized, fully executed contract for our massive European expansion and immensely complex, highly hostile takeover of an international shipping conglomerate that Monique had spearheaded and ruthlessly finalized. She had navigated the brutal international regulations and decimated the opposing corporate defenses with flawless surgical precision. The document represented billions in projected revenue and cemented Vanguard's absolute dominance on the global stage. I met her eyes, sharing a silent, profound look of mutual triumph and unbreakable solidarity. A warm, solid weight pressed gently against my knee. Duke, having quietly followed Monique out onto the terrace, nudged his massive head under my free hand, his dark, highly intelligent eyes looking up at me with unwavering devotion. I let my fingers sink into his thick, familiar fur, grounding myself in the perfect, tranquil reality of the moment. Holding the physical proof of our expanding global dominance in one hand, and feeling the steady, comforting presence of my fiercest protector against my side, the final absolute truth of the long, bitter war settled deep into my bones. The greatest revenge is never found in screaming matches, chaotic public confrontations, or desperate attempts to force an apology from those entirely incapable of remorse. The ultimate, most devastating retribution is the weapon of absolute silence. It is stepping back and simply allowing toxic, predatory people to consume themselves with their own insatiable greed, their own suffocating lies, and their own inevitable ruin. While they scramble in the dirt, fighting over the pathetic scraps of their fabricated, crumbling realities, you withdraw, redirect your immense energy, and quietly build an untouchable, magnificent empire from the very ashes they left behind. I looked out over the vast, endless horizon, my spirit soaring, my mind untouchable, knowing with absolute certainty that I had not just survived the fire, I had claimed the entire world. The power of indifference. The most profound lesson from this story is that true vindication is never found in retaliation or demanding apologies from toxic people. The ultimate revenge is simply walking away and allowing their destructive nature to consume them. By severing these poisonous ties, you reclaim your energy and redirect it toward building a life of purpose, strength, and authentic connections. Healing does not require closure from those who hurt you. It only requires your unwavering commitment to your own growth. Break the cycle, build your own empire, and let your unshakable peace speak for itself. How have you reclaimed your own peace from a toxic situation? Share your story in the comments below.